Hello story seekers, welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. Let me take you back a few years, to a time when I was just another guy chasing tranquility in the great outdoors. My name is Michael, and I've always found solace in hiking. There's something grounding about stepping away from the hum of civilization and into the unfiltered embrace of nature. This story, though, is about one hike that changed my perspective forever. It was late autumn in the Pacific Northwest, that sweet spot when the air is crisp and the woods are blanketed in hues of orange and gold. I had planned a solo weekend trip to a national forest about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't my first solo hike, but this one felt different from the start. Not ominous, just different. I had prepped meticulously, as always. My backpack was loaded with essentials: a compact tent, a sleeping bag, a map, a compass, plenty of water, and enough food to last the weekend. I'd even splurged on a fancy new headlamp that boasted an impressive beam distance, which I figured would come in handy during the early sunsets. The drive out to the trailhead was uneventful. I passed small towns with sleepy diners and gas stations that looked frozen in time. The kind of places where people wave at you even if they don't know you. It was comforting, in a way a reminder that I wasn't heading into complete isolation. When I reached the trailhead, I parked my car in a gravel lot that could fit about a dozen vehicles. Only 3 other cars were there, suggesting I'd have a relatively quiet hike. Perfect. After a quick stretch and a last-minute gear check, I slung my backpack over my shoulders and stepped onto the trail. The forest greeted me with a cool breeze that carried the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The towering evergreens, moss-covered boulders, and trickling streams felt like old friends welcoming me back. The first few hours were uneventful in the best way possible. Birds chirped overhead, squirrels darted across the path, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at deer moving through the underbrush. I had planned to set up camp near a small lake about 7 miles in. It wasn't an official camping spot, but it was a well-known hidden gem among hikers in the area. As I walked, I couldn't help but appreciate the sheer beauty around me. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting patterns on the forest floor. Every step felt like a retreat into another world, one where the worries of everyday life couldn't follow. Around midday, I stopped to eat a quick lunch. Sitting on a fallen log, I unwrapped a simple sandwich and listened to the sounds of the forest. A woodpecker tapped rhythmically in the distance, and a nearby creek gurgled softly. I felt at peace. After lunch, I resumed my hike, the path winding deeper into the forest. The trail narrowed in places, flanked by dense ferns and towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Occasionally, I'd spot an old, weathered trail marker or a makeshift cairn, subtle reminders that others had walked this path before me. As the afternoon wore on, the forest grew quieter. The chirping birds and rustling leaves gave way to an almost eerie stillness. It wasn't unsettling at first, just one of those moments when nature seemed to pause. I chalked it up to the time of day. Animals were probably settling in for the evening. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was dipping low in the sky, painting the water with hues of gold and crimson. The lake was as serene as I'd hoped, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. I set up my tent a few yards from the shore, careful to follow leave no trace principles. As night fell, I built a small fire and sat by its glow, sipping on a cup of instant coffee. The temperature dropped quickly, and I wrapped myself in a jacket to keep warm. The stars above were breathtaking, unobstructed by city lights. For a while, I just sat there, feeling small under the vastness of the universe. It was a good day, a normal day. But as I prepared to crawl into my tent for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching me. Not in a menacing way, but as if it was aware of my presence. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after hours of solitude. The night was calm as I settled into my sleeping bag, the crackling of the fire slowly fading as the last embers died out. The forest was still, as if it were holding its breath. The only sound was the occasional gust of wind that rustled the branches above my tent. I had always loved the quiet of the woods at night, the sense of peace it brought, the way the darkness wrapped around you like a comforting blanket. But tonight, something felt off. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, a shift in the air, a slight weight pressing against the calm. The first sign that something was wrong came shortly after I had zipped myself into my tent. It was around 10 p.m., the perfect time for some rest before the hike back in the morning. I had just closed my eyes when I heard a rustling sound, not the usual crackle of leaves or the scurry of small animals, but something heavier. The sound was deliberate, slow, almost methodical. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or maybe a larger animal moving through the underbrush. The forest was home to all kinds of wildlife, from deer to elk to the occasional bear. It wasn't uncommon to hear something stirring in the woods at night. But this sound, it wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It was far too close. I waited, straining to hear more, but the forest returned to its eerie silence. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around my body and closed my eyes again, trying to brush off the feeling of unease that had begun to settle in. An hour passed. I had almost managed to drift off when the sound came again. This time, it was louder, unmistakably close to my tent. Something or someone was moving in the darkness just outside. I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot, the low thud of something heavy brushing against the branches. My heart began to race. I held my breath, listening carefully. The sound was constant now, circling around the perimeter of my tent, stopping every so often, only to start again. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was definitely too large to be a deer or a rabbit. I felt a prickle of fear crawl up my spine. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The tent was thin, and the fabric felt like it wouldn't provide much protection if whatever was out there decided to approach. I reached for my headlamp and turned it on, the beam of light piercing the darkness just beyond the tent walls. I saw nothing. The light illuminated only the trees and the grass at the edge of my campsite, nothing more. But the rustling continued. It was so close now that I could hear the occasional low grunt, like the sound of a person shifting or something exhaling heavily. I stood up quickly, my breath shallow, my body tensed. I grabbed the small, blunt-ended hiking stick I always carried with me on solo hikes, nothing that would do much damage, but enough to give me some kind of protection if things went south. My mind raced. Was it a person? A lost hiker or some stranger wandering the woods at night? The thought sent a cold shiver down my back. I wasn't exactly in a popular spot. No one else had been on the trail when I had arrived. It was unlikely someone else was camping this close. But maybe it was a wild animal? A bear, maybe, though the noise didn't quite fit. Bears didn't move in such a deliberate pattern. Whatever it was watching me, moving cautiously in the darkness. I crouched low, trying to steady my breathing as I listened. The rustling stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the winds in the trees. I waited. My heart was pounding now, too loud in my ears. What was I supposed to do? Just as I was about to step outside and investigate further, I heard something else, a low, muffled voice, barely audible over the wind. It sounded like a soft, guttural murmur, almost like someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. That was when I froze. My blood ran cold. No animals in the forest spoke. This was no bear or elk. My mind raced, coming up with 1,000 possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of animal, a cougar or something, mimicking human voices. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was an animal. It was something more unsettling. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trying to control the rising panic in my chest. The voice came again, closer now. It was almost as though it was right outside my tent, hovering just beyond the thin fabric. I couldn't take it anymore. My hand shook as I reached for the zipper, pulling it down carefully, trying not to make a sound. The cool night air rushed in as I stepped out, my heart hammering in my chest. I swept my headlamp around, but the light only caught empty space, the trees, the underbrush, and the small clearing where I had set up camp. No sign of movement. I glanced back at my tent, feeling a chill settle over me. Maybe I was just imagining things, I told myself. Maybe the quiet of the woods was playing tricks on me. But then my light flickered, briefly dimming before returning to full brightness. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the dark forest again. But still, there was nothing. Just the whispering winds, the shadows stretching in the moonlight. Reluctantly, I stepped back inside my tent. The rustling had stopped. The voice had gone silent. It was as though whatever had been out there was waiting, watching, to see what I would do. I couldn't explain it. I felt as though something had been toying with me. I lay back down in my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the trees, every snap of a twig, sent my senses into overdrive. My mind kept replaying the events, over and over. Had I imagined it? Was I just being paranoid? But the strange thing was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Something had changed. The forest, which had once felt so welcoming, now felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew in my gut that I had felt something out there, a presence. And it wasn't finished with me yet. The next morning, I woke up with an annoying sense of unease. The events of the night before were still fresh in my mind, and the sun, though high in the sky, didn't bring the comfort it usually did. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, watching me. I rolled out of my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of being watched. The forest was quieter than usual. Normally, there would be the occasional chirp of birds or the rustle of leaves as animals went about their business. But today it was eerily still. The air had a damp quality to it, the kind of humidity that clung to your skin and made everything feel heavier than it should. I started packing up my campsite, but even the mundane task of folding up my tent felt wrong. Every little noise, the zipper of my bag, the snap of a branch underfoot sounded too loud in the stillness. It was as though the world was amplifying every small sound, making it seem more significant than it was. By the time I had everything packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every step I took, every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone lurking in the trees. But there was nothing. The forest, while silent, was still the same on the surface. I decided to press on, hoping that some fresh air and a change of scenery would clear my head. I picked up my hiking stick and began to walk, the trail beneath my boots soft and muddy from the overnight moisture. The farther I went, the deeper I ventured into the forest, the more the unsettling feeling grew. At first, it was small things. The sound of leaves crunching beneath my feet would be interrupted by an odd, hollow echo. I would stop, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing, just the dense woods surrounding me. Every so often, I would hear what sounded like someone snapping a twig, but when I turned to look, there was no one in sight. The trees seemed to grow denser as I walked, the canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was thick and cloying now, pressing against me as if the forest itself were trying to keep me in. The deeper I went, the more I felt a pull, something drawing me further into the woods, as though the trail itself was changing, bending to its will. I hadn't planned on exploring too far today, but something was pushing me forward. I found myself walking faster, driven by a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. It wasn't until I stumbled across something unusual that I realized how far I had gone. At first, I thought I was seeing things. There, in the middle of the trail, was a strange mark on the ground, an indentation, as though something heavy had been dragged across the dirt. The earth around it was disturbed, and the shape was almost circular, like a large, deep depression. But what caught my eye wasn't the mark itself. It was the odd, faint glow surrounding it. almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. I crouched down, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of it. There was no explanation for the glow. It wasn't the sun, and it wasn't reflective light from anything around me. It was otherworldly. It seemed to pulse gently, as though it had a life of its own. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. It was as if the glow had a magnetic pull on me, drawing me in closer. Against every instinct I had, I stepped forward, cautiously placing my foot in the depression. The moment my boot made contact, I felt a sudden jolt, a sharp, tingling sensation that shot through my body, as if the very ground beneath me was alive. I pulled my foot back, stumbling slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. I was about to turn and leave when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible hum, like a low vibration in the air, filling the space around me. The sound was so faint that at first I thought it was just the wind or my imagination. But it was growing louder, more distinct, and with it came a coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. I looked around, but the forest was still. No sign of movement, no animals, no birds, nothing. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread flood over me, but I couldn't leave. I had to know what was happening. It was like I was caught in a trance, drawn further into the woods by forces I didn't understand. The humming grew louder, and with it, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. I looked down in horror as the earth began to tremble, tiny cracks forming in the soil, as though something deep beneath was stirring. Suddenly, the humming stopped. The forest fell silent again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This was oppressive. The air felt thick, too heavy to breathe. I took a deep breath, but it didn't feel like enough. It was as though the very oxygen was being sucked from the space around me. I turned to leave, my legs unsteady, my mind racing. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, was overwhelming now. I had to get out of here. But as I started to retrace my steps, something caught my eye. A figure, half hidden in the trees, standing perfectly still. It was tall, unnaturally so, and I could make out no clear features, just a dark silhouette against the green backdrop of the forest. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to look away. Then it moved, slow, deliberate, but with a purpose. My heart began to race as I backed away, taking small, careful steps. But no matter how far I moved, the figure kept pace, always staying just at the edge of my vision. It never came closer, but it never disappeared either. The sensation of being followed was unmistakable now. I was no longer alone. Something or someone was out there, in the woods with me. And it wasn't human. I started running, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible, adrenaline surging through me. The woods, once a sanctuary, had become a maze. The trail that had seemed so familiar just hours ago was now twisting and turning in ways I couldn't explain. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, but the feeling of being pursued never let up. The figure was still there, just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, but when I looked back, there was nothing. The forest had become an impossible place, a space where the laws of reality didn't seem to apply, and I was trapped in it. The longer I ran, the less I felt like myself, as though the woods were slowly taking hold of my mind, making me part of their twisted, unending game. I stumbled again, my foot catching on a root hidden in the underbrush. The forest was closing in around me, and I had no idea where I was going or what would happen next. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't stop running. Not yet. Not until I understood what had taken me into the heart of this dark, strange place. I don't know how much time passed, but when I finally stumbled into a small clearing, my legs were burning, my chest tight with exhaustion, and my mind was on the verge of breaking. I was deep in the forest now, farther than I ever intended to go. Every inch of the place felt alien, as if the forest itself had become a different world, one I couldn't escape. My mind raced. My heart pounded in my ears. I had to keep moving, had to keep going, but the overwhelming exhaustion was starting to take hold. The feeling of being chased had intensified, like something was just behind me, closing in with every step I took. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind made my blood run cold. It was too quiet, too still, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I paused in the middle of the clearing, trying to catch my breath, but before I could take another step, I heard a sound, soft at first, like the rustling of fabric or leaves in the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The sound grew louder, closer, and then I saw it. The figure from earlier, the tall, dark shape I'd seen lingering in the trees, was standing at the edge of the clearing. I froze, my entire body going rigid. It was there, clear as day, not a shadow anymore, but an unmistakable presence. The figure was no longer hidden. It was full-bodied, towering, its form dark and shifting, like something that wasn't quite human. The air around me seemed to thicken. The once pleasant scent of the forest turned sour, acrid. My throat tightened as I tried to breathe, but I felt as though something was suffocating me from the inside. Every instinct told me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't look away from it, the figure that stood in the periphery of my vision, its form twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, my heart hammering in my chest. The longer I stared at it, the more I could feel its presence pressing down on me. The figure wasn't just standing there, it was watching me, studying me, as though it could see right through me. My pulse quickened, and I could hear the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then, without warning, it moved. It took one deliberate step forward, and the sound of its movement was like nothing I'd ever heard before. The ground beneath my feet trembled, the air around me thickening as though the entire forest itself were holding its breath. I could feel a weight on my chest, a crushing sensation, and my vision blurred. I staggered back, finally able to move, but the figure was still coming closer. My body was filled with terror, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the thing that was moving toward me. It wasn't human. Its limbs were impossibly long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its body seeming to bend and shift like a grotesque mockery of life. A low, guttural sound began to emerge from it, more of a vibration than anything audible. It reverberated through the ground, through the air. The sound was inside me now, vibrating my bones, my organs. It was as though the figure was reaching inside my body, twisting my insides, pulling at my very essence. I was paralyzed, every muscle in my body locked in place. And then it spoke. But the voice, it wasn't a voice. It was more of a feeling, a thought that pressed directly into my mind. No words were spoken out loud, yet I heard it as clearly as if it had been said to me. The message was simple, chilling, and direct. You should not have come here. I felt the weight of those words press down on me like a physical force. The air around me seemed to grow heavier still. Each breath I took a struggle. I wanted to scream, to beg, to plead for mercy, but my voice was stuck, my mouth dry, my throat closing up. The terror inside me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I felt my body tremble, my knees buckling beneath me, and yet I couldn't look away from the figure. It took another step, then another, and with each step, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees appeared to shift, their trunks warping and twisting, as if the very land itself was bending to the will of this being. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as if the earth was no longer solid, but a strange, pulsing thing, alive and shifting. In that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. This was not a forest I had wandered into. This was not just an ordinary place in nature. The forest, the trees, the very earth beneath my feet, was part of this entity, part of something ancient and far beyond human comprehension. It was as though the land itself was alive, aware, and had been waiting for me. The figure, now so close that I could feel its cold presence pressing against me, reached out. Its hand, no, its appendage was impossibly long, its fingers ending in sharp, twisted claws. It moved toward me, and in that instant, All of my fear crystallized into one overwhelming emotion, pure terror. I could see its face now, or what passed for a face. Its features were distorted, unfathomable, a grotesque combination of shapes and shadows. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark, empty voids, like black holes that seemed to suck in all light, all hope, all life. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, just as I thought the thing would reach me, would consume me whole, the world around me shifted. The air turned colder still, and the ground beneath me cracked. A flash of blinding light tore through the clearing, and the figure screamed, not with a voice, but with a sound that resonated deep inside me, shaking my very soul. I stumbled backward, falling onto the damp earth. My body was alive with pain, my mind a chaotic mess of thoughts, and my heart was racing so fast that I thought I might pass out from the sheer terror of it all. The figure faltered, as though the force of whatever had interrupted it had stunned it for a moment. It paused, its body twitching and distorting as though it were struggling against some unseen force. The air hummed with energy, and I could feel the ground beneath me tremble once more. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The clearing, once thick with terror and dread, was silent again. The oppressive air lifted. The trees stopped moving. The forest, as if exhausted, seemed to exhale a long, slow breath. I remained on the ground, frozen, my mind unable to process what had just happened. Was it real? Was it a hallucination brought on by fear or exhaustion? My body screamed for me to get up, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The figure was gone, but the mark it left on me, the feeling of its presence, of the weight of the forest pressing in, remained. And as I lay there, shaking and gasping for air, I realized with chilling clarity that the forest had never been just trees, dirt, and animals. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. Was it a trick of the mind? A hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sheer intensity of what I had experienced, the way the air had shifted, the way the earth had trembled, those weren't things created by my mind. I had felt them, physically, and I could still feel the weight of that presence pressing down on me. I sat there in the clearing, shivering uncontrollably, not knowing how long I'd been there. My limbs felt heavy, as if the terror had drained the life out of me. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, trying to calm my pounding heart. Every part of me wanted to run, to flee as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. The thought of leaving this clearing, of stepping back into the forest after everything that had happened, filled me with more dread than I could bear. And yet, I knew I had no choice. I had to get out of here. The realization came slowly, like a distant whisper, that there was no other option. The forest wasn't just a backdrop to my hike. It was something much more dangerous, something that had been waiting for me. I couldn't stay here. If I did, I was certain the forest would claim me completely. Whatever that thing was, whatever force had been lurking in the trees, I couldn't be its next victim. Shaking, I slowly pushed myself to my feet, each movement agonizing. My body ached from the strain, from the hours of panic and adrenaline that had coursed through me. The forest around me was still too quiet, as though it was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I could feel the eyes of the trees on me. It was the same feeling I'd had earlier when I thought I was being followed. That sense of being observed, as if something was out there, waiting for me to make a mistake. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my throat was dry, my senses overwhelmed by the terror that still gripped me. The once familiar path was now foreign, warped by the events I had just experienced. I had no idea which way to go, no idea how to retrace my steps back to the entrance of the forest. I couldn't even remember the way I had come in. Everything seemed distorted, like a dream that I couldn't fully wake up from. But I had to move. I had to try. With trembling hands, I pushed through the underbrush, my legs threatening to collapse under me with every step. The forest around me felt oppressive, as though it was closing in. The trees seemed taller now, their branches stretching over me like dark, gnarled hands. The path was barely visible, swallowed by the thick foliage, but I pushed on, driven by the desperate need to escape. Minutes, maybe hours passed. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion. It was the feeling that something was still watching, still following. It was a nagging sensation, like a hand on the back of my neck, urging me to keep going, to keep moving. But my body was failing me. My legs were stiff, my muscles aching, my mind on the edge of breaking. I needed to get out, but the path was gone, lost to the thick underbrush and tangled roots. The clearing where I had last seen that terrible figure was now a distant memory, replaced by an endless sea of trees and shadows. The sensation of being followed grew stronger, the sound of footsteps too heavy, too deliberate echoing in the distance. I didn't dare look back. If I did, I feared I would see it again, that thing, lurking just behind me. I had to move faster, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the forest itself had grown tired of my presence and was now pushing back, pulling me deeper into its twisted embrace. Suddenly, I saw something in the distance, a flicker of light, a faint glimmer in the darkness. My heart surged with hope. Could it be? Was that the way out? Or was it just another illusion, another trap set by the forest to lure me deeper? I didn't care. I was running now, my legs pumping, my breath ragged as I pushed myself toward that distant light. The air was thick, suffocating, but I refused to stop. The forest was too much. I couldn't let it claim me. I couldn't face that thing again. As I neared the light, my vision blurred, and I stumbled forward, tripping over a tree root. I fell hard to the ground, the impact jarring through my bones. For a moment, I lay there, too exhausted to move. My body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I got back on my feet, my hands scraping the earth as I pulled myself up. The light was so close now. It was a small, glowing spot amidst the dark woods. It felt like a beacon, a lifeline. I staggered toward it, pushing through the dense forest as the sounds of the footsteps grew louder, closer. But when I reached the source of the light, I froze. It wasn't an exit. It wasn't a way out at all. It was a campfire. The fire burned brightly, its flames dancing in the still night air. But it wasn't the warmth that chilled me. It was the figures sitting beside it. It wasn't human. The creature, or whatever it was, sat cross-legged by the fire, its body twisted and unnatural, like a grotesque mockery of a person. Its face was half hidden by a hood, its skin pale and sickly, and its eyes, those black, empty eyes, stared directly at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And for the second time that night, I heard that voice in my mind. The voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a presence that seemed to speak directly into my soul. You should not have come here. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble again, and I could feel the forest closing in around me, the trees bending toward me. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. I could feel its power, its control over the land. I realized, with horrifying clarity, that I wasn't just lost. I was never meant to leave. But as the forest pressed down on me, I heard something else, a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. The sound of a distant, human voice calling my name. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't know if it was another trap. But the desperation in that voice made me move, made me stumble away from the fire, away from the figure that still watched me with those dark, unblinking eyes. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had before, pushing through the branches, ignoring the branches that tore at my skin, ignoring the pain in my legs. The voice was louder now, more urgent. I had no idea who it was, but I was too scared to question it. And then, through the trees, I saw it light. Real light. Streetlights. I was close to the edge of the forest. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the small clearing near the trailhead, I collapsed onto the ground. I couldn't remember how I had gotten there. I couldn't remember how long I'd been running. My chest heaved with each breath. my mind spinning with what I'd seen, what I'd felt, what I'd experienced. But the forest was behind me now, and I never looked back. The forest may have let me go, but I knew deep in my bones that it wasn't finished with me. As the days passed, the memory of what had happened in that forest seemed to fade, like a nightmare lingering just beyond my reach. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was all a product of fear, exhaustion, and an overactive imagination, I knew deep down that something had happened. Something that I could never fully explain or understand. The forest had left its mark on me, etched into my soul in a way that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. I didn't speak about it to anyone. What could I say? How could I explain the things I'd experienced? How could I tell anyone that the woods were alive, that they were watching, waiting for me? It sounded absurd, even to me. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the crackling of that fire, still feel the weight of those black eyes on me, still sense the presence that lingered long after I had left. I tried to go back to my normal life, but the quiet hum of the everyday world now felt alien to me. The comfort of the mundane, of work and routine, was no longer enough to distract me from the knowledge that the world wasn't as simple as I had once thought. The forest, the things in it, were out there, and I was no longer naive enough to believe that I could just forget about them. It was on a cold evening, weeks after I had escaped, when I was sitting in my living room, staring out the window at the darkened woods that lay just beyond the edge of town. A chill crawled down my spine, and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the forest was still watching. The trees stood like silent sentinels, unmoving and still, but I could feel their gaze, feel them studying me from the distance. It was a feeling that settled into the pit of my stomach, the kind of knowing that you can't ignore, even if you don't fully understand it. The forest had seen me. It had recognized me. And there was something there, deep within it, something that had been awakened the moment I had stepped onto its soil. I had been marked, chosen in some way, and I knew that it was not something I could easily escape from. That night, as I lay in bed, the dark shadows of the room stretching out like cold fingers, I heard something I had not heard since I left the forest, the distant rustling of leaves. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, like something brushing against the ground, moving through the trees, inching closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to listen. Was it just the wind? Could it be my imagination playing tricks on me again? But no, this was different. It was deliberate. The sound of footsteps, heavy and purposeful, like something or someone was walking through the woods, heading toward my home. My pulse raced. I couldn't move. The terror from that night in the forest came rushing back, flooding my veins with ice. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my chest tightening. The forest was no longer some distant thing. It was here, right at my doorstep. It was coming for me. I didn't dare look out the window. I couldn't bring myself to see if there was something out there, standing in the shadows, waiting for me to notice. All I could do was lie there, trembling under the covers, my thoughts racing, my heart thundering in my chest. The sound continued, slow, measured, and relentless. It moved closer, closer still, until I was sure that whatever it was would be right outside my door. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would just go away, that it would leave me in peace. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The woods fell silent. The air around me seemed to hold its breath, as if everything were waiting. I didn't know what had happened or why it had stopped, but I wasn't about to question it. I just lay there, motionless, waiting for dawn to come, hoping that the night would end and the terror would dissipate with the rising sun. The next morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods once again, though this time I wasn't there out of curiosity. I had no intention of going back into that forest. What I had seen, what I had felt, it had been enough. The forest had claimed its territory, and I had no desire to test it further. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lingering, watching from the depths of the trees. It wasn't just the trees, though. It was the land itself, the air that hung heavy with something ancient, something beyond the natural world. I had become part of it now, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how many miles I put between myself and the forest, I knew that it would always be there, just beyond the edge of my mind, just out of reach. And so, I live with it now. The knowledge that the forest has left a part of itself with me. It is a part of me, whether I like it or not. Every time I hear the wind rustle through the trees, every time I catch a glimpse of the shadows moving just beyond the light, I remember. I remember what happened, what I saw, and I know that the forest is never far away. It all started on a crisp fall evening when I found myself with a group of friends, each of us looking for something different, adventure, curiosity, and maybe even a little thrill. The air was biting, hinting that winter was fast approaching. It was late, much later than we had planned, and yet the decision was made. We would explore an abandoned hospital that stood just outside town, untouched for decades. The hospital had always been the subject of rumors. Everyone in our small town had heard the stories, strange noises, lights flickering at night, and the eerie feeling that surrounded the building. Yet, no one ever really dared to go inside. It stood there, decaying and abandoned, as a silent testament to time's passage and the dark history of its past. Some said it had been closed due to a scandal, others claimed it was haunted, and there were even whispers about strange experiments that had taken place within its walls. But none of that really mattered to us. We were young and fearless, looking for something to break the monotony of our daily lives. It was a typical evening at first. We were all gathered at a local diner, the warmth inside contrasting with the chill of the night air outside. The smell of greasy food filled the room as we discussed the latest gossip, joked about our plans, and made harmless bets on how long we could last inside that hospital. Among the group was my best friend, Ben. He was the type who always led the charge in any adventure, and tonight was no different. His enthusiasm was infectious, and before I knew it, we were all standing at the entrance to the derelict building, our flashlights casting long shadows on the overgrown grass. The building itself loomed above us, its broken windows like dark eyes, watching our every move. There was a strange sense of excitement mixed with a bit of hesitation in the air. It felt like we were on the edge of something big, something we couldn't quite comprehend. But what struck me the most was how normal everything felt. We were just a group of friends, enjoying the evening together. We weren't thinking about ghosts or strange noises yet. It was simply a new experience, one we thought would be thrilling, but ultimately harmless. The last time we had all done something this reckless was when we snuck into a factory on the outskirts of town. That was a lot of fun, and we came out with just a few bumps and bruises. This time, we figured, would be no different. I remember the sound of my shoes crunching on the gravel path leading up to the main entrance. The wind was rustling through the dead leaves that had accumulated around the edges of the building, and every now and then you could hear the creak of the old structure as if it was groaning under its own weight. It was the kind of place that would have sent most people running in the other direction, but we were too curious to turn back now. We had already come so far, and no one wanted to be the first to back out. The main door was slightly ajar, as if the hospital itself was inviting us, and a faint musty smell seeped through the crack. And as I pushed the door open, I was greeted by the overwhelming silence of the place. There were no sounds of life, no whispers, no creaks of movement, just an eerie stillness. It was so quiet, in fact, that I could almost hear the beating of my own heart as we stepped inside. The building was a maze of dark corridors and rotting walls. The further we ventured in, the more we felt like we were trespassing in a place that had long been forgotten by the world. There was graffiti on the walls, But it wasn't the playful kind you'd expect from teenagers. It was darker, more disturbing. The once white walls had yellowed and cracked, with patches of mold growing in places, as if the building was slowly being consumed by time. The lights had long since stopped working, leaving us to rely solely on our flashlights. They flickered as we moved deeper into the building, adding an unsettling layer of tension to the atmosphere. We came across what appeared to be an old receptionist's desk, its wood warped and decayed. The chairs were overturned, and scattered papers lay on the floor, some of which were too faded to read. It was as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry, leaving behind the remnants of a life that had once been there. At first, we stayed close together, our laughter filling the air as we made our way down hallways and through old patient rooms. Each room we entered told a different story, with old medical equipment left behind, some of it still in relatively good condition despite the years of neglect. We joked about the hospital's former patients, imagining what kinds of strange ailments had been treated here. I remember feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as we passed one room in particular. The door was half open, and as I glanced inside, I caught a glimpse of something, a figure, maybe? Standing in the corner, I couldn't be sure, and when I asked the others if they'd seen it too, they shrugged it off as a trick of the light. I laughed nervously and pushed the thought from my mind, but something about that moment lingered in the back of my head, a small knot of unease that would only grow tighter as the night wore on. As we ventured deeper into the hospital, the air grew thicker, colder. It felt like we were no longer just exploring a forgotten building. We were trespassing on something much older, much darker. But we were so caught up in the thrill of the adventure that we barely noticed how the mood had shifted. What had started as a fun, light-hearted exploration now felt like something more sinister was looming just around the corner, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But we didn't turn back. We were far too curious, too eager to see what lay hidden behind the crumbling walls of the hospital. As we continued to explore, the adrenaline started to wear off. The initial excitement of stepping into a place so old, so decayed, began to give way to a growing sense of unease. The building seemed to stretch endlessly before us, its hallways twisting and turning into darkness. The occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet was the only sound breaking the silence, and for some reason, the further we ventured in, the more the atmosphere seemed to press in around us, as though the very walls were watching. Ben led the way as usual, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, his voice confident and steady as he cracked jokes to keep the mood light. The others followed, some of us talking, some of us staying quiet, our nerves fraying a little at the edges. I, for one, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Every now and then, my eyes would dart to the corners of the rooms, expecting to see someone or something watching us. But there was never anything there. Still, that sense of being watched persisted, and I couldn't ignore it. We found ourselves in a long hallway that stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were lined with rusted pipes and broken tiles, and the air grew colder the further we walked. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was like the very air around us was heavier, more oppressive. I could feel it settling on my chest, making it harder to breathe. We had been walking for what felt like hours, and I noticed that the further we got, the quieter it became. The muffled sounds of our footsteps were the only things breaking the silence. It felt like we had wandered into a place that had been untouched by time, where the outside world didn't exist anymore. It was as though the hospital had created its own bubble of isolation, cut off from everything around it. That's when we heard it, the sound that would change everything. At first, it was subtle, a faint, almost inaudible thud. It didn't even register at first, but when it came again, louder this time, we all froze in our tracks. A low, hollow thump echoed through the hallway, coming from somewhere ahead of us, in the direction we had been walking. I could feel my heart rate increase, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Ben looked back at us, his face illuminated by the beam of his flashlight, his expression unreadable. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice unusually tense. We all nodded, exchanging uneasy glances. None of us had seen anyone else in the building, and we certainly hadn't heard anything resembling footsteps or movement before. We had assumed we were alone. "I'll go check it out," Ben said, his voice betraying the uncertainty he was trying to hide. He wasn't afraid, but there was something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't entirely comfortable either. Despite the bravado, his voice wavered as he led the way down the hallway, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. We followed behind him, our footsteps hesitant, our eyes constantly flicking around, expecting to see something lurking in the corners. As we moved down the corridor, the sound came again, this time louder, more distinct. A heavy thud, followed by the scraping of something along the floor. It wasn't a human sound, at least not like any we'd ever heard. It was unnatural, hollow, almost mechanical, and it sent a chill down my spine. Ben's flashlight illuminated a door at the far end of the hallway, slightly ajar. The sound seemed to be coming from behind it. We approached slowly, our steps careful and deliberate, as though any sudden movement might disturb whatever was waiting for us on the other side. Ben reached for the door handle, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The silence was deafening, and I could feel the tension thickening the air. Then, without warning, the door creaked open on its own. A cold gust of air rushed past us as the door swung wide, the beam of Ben's flashlight revealing a room beyond. It was small, cluttered with old medical equipment and rusty metal tables. But what caught my eye wasn't the room itself, it was the figure standing in the corner. At first, I thought it was a shadow, something cast by the dim light of the flashlight. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its body was bent in an odd angle. Its limbs seemed too long, too thin, like they didn't quite fit the rest of its form. The figure was wearing a tattered white gown, stained and torn in places, and its head was lowered, obscured by a mass of tangled hair. For a moment, no one moved. We stood there, frozen in place, our breath caught in our throats. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing to my ears, drowning out everything else. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just stood there, as if waiting for us to make the first move. I was the first to break the silence. I couldn't help it, the fear surged up inside me, and before I could stop myself, I stepped backward, my voice shaking. "Ben, let's go. We need to get out of here. Now." Ben didn't react immediately, his eyes still locked on the figure. But then, slowly, he stepped back as well, his flashlight flickering as he turned to face us. "Are you sure?" I didn't see anything," he said, his voice wavering. But I knew what I saw. I had no doubt in my mind. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and I wanted nothing to do with it. We began to back away from the door, moving slowly, as though we feared that any sudden movement might provoke it. But the figure didn't follow us. It just stood there, unmoving, watching us with its head lowered. The atmosphere in the room felt heavier now, the air thick with an almost palpable presence. It was as if the building itself was closing in on us, trapping us inside with something we couldn't understand. We reached the end of the hallway, still watching the door, expecting the figure to emerge at any moment. But it didn't. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, none of us daring to speak, none of us willing to acknowledge what we had just seen. Ben's flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, it felt like the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, after what felt like an endless pause, Ben turned to us, his face pale and drawn. "We're leaving. Now." Without another word, we turned and fled down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the silence, the sound of our breath ragged and panicked. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly as we made our way back toward the entrance, but it didn't disappear completely. We didn't talk as we ran, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our minds racing with what we had just witnessed. None of us could explain it, and the fear that gripped me tightened with every step I took away from that room. We made it outside, into the cold night air, but the sense of unease didn't vanish. The darkness of the hospital loomed behind us, and even though we had left, I could still feel its presence lingering in my mind, waiting for me to remember what we had seen. The night air outside the hospital was frigid, but it didn't seem to clear the dread that lingered in my chest. We stood in a tight group, our breath visible in the cold, none of us speaking. The door to the abandoned hospital stood behind us like a dark sentinel, its presence looming even from the outside. The initial shock of our escape hadn't worn off. In fact, the fear had only deepened as the night stretched on. Ben was the first to speak, his voice strained. "I don't know about you guys, but I'm not going back in there." I thought I was prepared for anything, but whatever that thing was, I can't explain it. "I'm done." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like the logical thing to do. We should leave, go home, and forget about the night's events. But the uncertainty gnawed at me. We had seen something that didn't belong in that hospital, and I couldn't just walk away from it. I wanted answers. But more than that, I needed to know that what we saw wasn't a figment of our imagination. I turned to the others, my voice shaky but firm. "We have to go back in. We need to find out what's going on in there." I could see the hesitation in their eyes, but none of them disagreed. There was a quiet, shared understanding that what we had witnessed wasn't just some freak accident. There was something else, something far worse, lurking in the shadows of that hospital. And we weren't going to be able to live with ourselves until we figured out what. We returned to the hospital, this time with more caution. Our flashlights illuminated the dark hallway ahead, each step feeling heavier than the last. The building felt different now, less like a place abandoned by time, and more like a tomb, sealed and waiting. The silence that had greeted us before was oppressive, as though the walls themselves were listening, waiting. The air inside was colder than it had been earlier, and I could feel the temperature drop as we entered. The faint scent of mildew mixed with something else, something chemical. It stung the back of my throat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital had an odor all its own, like it had absorbed years of decay and despair. My skin crawled with each breath. We followed the same path we'd taken earlier, back toward the room where we had seen the figure. But this time, the building felt different. The floors creaked louder beneath our feet, as if the place was groaning under our weight. The once still air seemed to hum with a strange energy, and every sound, every movement was amplified in the empty spaces. I felt the tension build in my chest as we approached the door we had fled from earlier. I could almost hear the thudding of my heartbeat in my ears, and I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what we had seen or what we might find now. The thought of that figure still haunted me, and though we hadn't seen it since our escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching us, waiting. Ben was the first to reach the door. He paused before pushing it open, his hand hovering over the handle. "We're not going to find it, are we?" he asked quietly. "Whatever we saw, it's not here." I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to believe that, but I knew deep down that something wasn't right. "We need to check," I replied. He turned the handle, and the door creaked open, its sound filling the space with a dull, echoing groan. As we stepped into the room, our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the same cluttered mess of old equipment and broken tables. But something was different. The room felt off. There was a heaviness to it, as though the air itself had thickened. I felt my pulse quicken as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to the corners, the shadows. But there was nothing. No figure standing in the corner, no movement, nothing to indicate that anything had been there at all. The room was still eerily still. It felt like time had stopped the moment we left. But just as I was starting to breathe easier, I heard it again, the same thud, the same hollow scrape, coming from behind a large, rusted medical cabinet near the back of the room. I froze, the blood draining from my face. Ben and the others turned to look at me, their faces pale, their eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ben didn't say anything at first. He just nodded slowly, his flashlight trained on the spot where the sound had come from. We stood there for a moment, listening. The air was thick with tension, every breath we took feeling like it could shatter the silence. And then there it was again, a soft, scraping sound, followed by a low thud. "Okay," Ben said, his voice low and tense. "I don't know what the hell is going on here, but I think it's time to leave." But before we could make a move, the door slammed shut behind us. The suddenness of the noise made us all jump, and I spun around, my heart racing. The door was closed completely shut, yet I could have sworn it was open just seconds ago. Panic began to rise in my chest, but Ben quickly shoved his shoulder against it, trying to force it open. "It's stuck," he muttered under his breath, straining with all his weight against the door. I stepped back, my mind racing. This is wrong. We need to get out of here." The air in the room grew colder, and I could feel a draft brushing against the back of my neck. The temperature had dropped even further, to the point where my breath was visible in the air. Then we heard it. A low, gurgling noise coming from the far corner of the room. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. A disturbing sound, like someone knew something was trying to breathe. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the panic rising inside me. We weren't alone. That much was certain. The scraping noise continued, this time louder and more frequent, as though something was dragging itself across the floor. Ben was now visibly sweating, his breath shallow. "We need to find another way out," he said, his voice strained with fear. He was trying to stay composed, but I could see the terror in his eyes. We rushed to the back of the room, desperately searching for any other exit. My eyes kept darting to the shadows, expecting something to lunge out at us, but there was nothing. Just the sound, the awful, awful sound of whatever was moving in the dark. It was getting closer. I could feel the presence in the room now, suffocating, pressing down on me, and the air seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. Every sound seemed to be magnified: our footsteps, our breathing, the creaking of the floorboards beneath us. And then the scraping stopped. There was silence. We stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, the fear eating away at us. I turned slowly, unable to shake the sense that whatever was in that room was watching us, waiting for the right moment. And that's when I saw it. A figure, hunched over, moving slowly toward us from the far corner of the room. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body twisted in a grotesque angle, and its face, oh God, its face was obscured by tangled hair, but I could see its eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and they were fixed directly on me. For a split second, everything seemed to stop. My breath caught in my throat, and the room seemed to tilt. The figure moved closer, its feet dragging along the floor as though it were struggling to move. And then, without warning, it lunged. The air in the room was suffocating. The low, gurgling sound had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt almost like a calm before a storm. Time seemed to stretch in those moments, each second dragging on longer than the last as the grotesque figure inched closer, dragging itself toward us with a terrible, unnatural slowness. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I tried to move, tried to breathe, but my body wouldn't respond. Fear had locked me in place, a prisoner to the horror unfolding in front of me. The figure's movements were jerky, disjointed, as though it was struggling to maintain its form. Its long limbs seemed to twist and contort with every step, and I could hear the faintest crackling sound, like bones breaking and reforming under its skin. But the most horrifying part by far was its face. It was a face I could barely comprehend, a twisted combination of human features and something else, something far worse. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too thin over the skull. Its eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, were pools of darkness, devoid of any human warmth, filled with an emptiness that sent a shiver down my spine. Its mouth hung open, lips pulled back into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp teeth that seemed far too numerous for any normal human mouth. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't. The figure's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt as though I were caught in a trance. My mind was screaming at me to move, but my body refused to obey. It was as though the figure's gaze had frozen me in place, binding me to the spot. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. I barely had time to react. The air seemed to rip apart as the creature shot forward, its long skeletal arms reaching for me. In the blink of an eye, it was upon me, its hands clamping down on my shoulders with inhuman strength. The force of its grip sent a shockwave of pain through my body, and I gasped, my breath caught in my throat. The creature's face was inches from mine, its grotesque smile widening as it tilted its head to one side, studying me with its dark, lifeless eyes. The stench of decay and rot filled my nostrils, choking me as I struggled to break free. But the more I fought, the tighter its grip became. I could feel its nails digging into my skin, cold and sharp like needles, and the fear coursing through me was so intense that it threatened to overwhelm every rational thought. I had never felt so powerless in my life. Ben and the others were shouting, their voices barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. I could hear their footsteps as they scrambled to get away from the creature, but all I could focus on was the thing holding me in place, its foul breath hot against my face. It was laughing softly, unnervingly, as though it found some twisted amusement in my terror. Suddenly, I felt it something else, something far worse than the creature's touch. A coldness seeped into my bones, as though the air itself had turned to ice. My vision blurred, and I could feel my limbs going numb, the strength draining from my body. It was as though the very presence of the creature was draining me of everything that made me human, leaving nothing but an empty shell behind. I had to get away. I had to survive. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I shoved against the creature's chest, my hands pushing against its cold, clammy skin. It recoiled for a moment, just enough to loosen its grip. That was all the opportunity I needed. I pulled myself free and stumbled backward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened, what I had just seen. But before I could get far, I felt a sharp pain in my side, and I cried out, looking down to see dark, wet marks staining my clothes. The creature's hands were still reaching for me. But then, something changed. A sharp, metallic sound echoed through the room, a sound that didn't belong to us. I turned to see one of the others, Mark, standing near the back of the room, his face twisted in shock. In his hands was a metal rod, something he had picked up from the wreckage in the corner. With a primal scream, he swung it at the creature, the rod connecting with a sickening crack. The creature let out a deafening shriek, its hands flying up to shield its face. It staggered back, but there was no time to revel in the small victory. The figure's dark, empty eyes snapped to Mark, and its grotesque grin spread even wider. It was coming after him now. I couldn't think. I couldn't even breathe. Everything around me was chaos loud, disorienting, and suffocating. I heard Ben shout something, but his voice was drowned out by the relentless screeching that filled the room. The figure wasn't just attacking anymore, it was hunting, and it was hunting all of us. Mark's back hit the wall as the creature closed in on him, its twisted limbs reaching out with inhuman speed. He swung the rod again, this time catching the creature in the chest. But the creature barely flinched, its eyes narrowing as it locked onto him. The room seemed to darken, the shadows thickening as the figure grew even more menacing. It raised one long, clawed hand, preparing to strike. I didn't think. I acted. I dove toward the creature, grabbing anything I could find. My hands closed around a broken chair leg, and I swung it with all my strength at the figure. The impact was jarring, and the creature's head snapped back, the sharp crack of its skull making me wince. But the figure didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow more furious, more relentless. It reached out with its other hand, slashing at the air, and I felt its claws tear through my jacket as I dodged, barely escaping its grasp. The fear was overwhelming now, suffocating, and my heart felt as though it was about to explode from the pressure. I could hear my friends screaming, but I couldn't look at them. I couldn't focus on anything except the thing in front of me. And then I heard something, a sound so faint that it could have been my imagination. It was a whisper, but not a whisper from the creature. It came from somewhere else deep within the shadows of the room. It was a voice, a human voice. and it was speaking words I couldn't understand. The creature paused, its head tilting slightly to one side. It seemed confused, as if the sound had distracted it. But it didn't matter. The distraction lasted only a second. The figure lunged again. I saw everything in slow motion, its long arms reaching, its mouth opening wider than it should have been able to. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, something else happened. There was a blinding flash of light. The creature recoiled, its body writhing as though it were being burned. A high-pitched screech filled the room as the light grew brighter and brighter, until it consumed everything. The figure's twisted form crumbled into the light, its body dissolving into nothingness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. The air was still thick with tension, and the room felt strangely quiet. After the flash of light, everything seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was an unsettling normalcy. The silence that filled the room was deafening, suffocating even. We stood there, frozen, not quite sure if the nightmare was truly over. Was the thing gone for good? Had it just been vanquished, or was it waiting for us to lower our guard? I turned toward my friends. Mark was standing, leaning against the wall for support, his face pale and eyes wide, as though he had just witnessed something that broke the very rules of reality. He glanced at me, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "What the hell just happened?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't have an answer. I could barely make sense of what had just transpired. The creature, whatever it had been, was gone, but there was a part of me that didn't trust the stillness. We'd seen what it was capable of. We'd seen it tear through the very fabric of reality, dragging us all into its twisted world. Could it truly be gone, or had it only retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again? Ben was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave." "Now," he said, his voice firm but trembling. He wasn't looking at any of us, just staring ahead, as if the very act of speaking might draw the creature back. His words were like a slap to my senses, and I nodded quickly. I didn't want to be here any longer. This place, this cursed hospital, was no longer just a building. It felt like a wound in the world, something that should never have existed, and now that we had experienced its horrors, we were bound to it. We had to leave. But as we turned to head for the exit, the weight of the place seemed to press down on us, slowing our steps. The hallway, once empty and foreboding, now felt strangely alive with the remnants of the terror we just witnessed. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the faint hum of the flickering lights overhead sounded like the mocking whispers of a presence that had yet to be vanquished. We moved quickly, almost too quickly. There was no time for hesitation. Every creak of the floor beneath our feet seemed like a warning, every shadow stretching just a little too far. We stumbled through the darkened halls, our footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the very building itself was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake, to falter. When we finally reached the front doors, I thought I could breathe again. The heavy wooden doors loomed in front of us like a barrier between us and whatever horrors lay behind. I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. But then, as I pulled the door open, something caught my attention. It was the reflection in the glass. For a split second, I saw it just a fleeting image, like a shadow in the corner of my eye. But it was enough to freeze me in place. There, behind us, in the darkened hallway, something moved. It was only for a moment, but I saw it clearly, two dark, empty eyes staring at us from the shadows. The same eyes, the same smile. I spun around, my heart racing. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Just the same empty hallway we had passed through. My breath caught in my throat, and I fought to steady myself. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ben turned to look, his eyes wide with panic. No, I didn't see anything." "What the hell's wrong with you?" he snapped, his voice sharp with anxiety. I wasn't sure what I had seen. Had it been real? Had the creature somehow survived? Or was I simply losing my mind after everything that had happened? The uncertainty gnawed at me, and the doubts began to creep back in. Was it truly over? We didn't have time to dwell on it. Without saying another word, we rushed out of the building, desperate to put as much distance between ourselves and the hospital as possible. The night air was cold against my skin, a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. But even as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As we made our way to the cars, we didn't speak much. There were no celebratory remarks, no relief in our voices. The trauma of what we'd just gone through had left us all in a state of numb shock. We piled into the cars, and the engines roared to life, breaking the eerie silence of the night. But as we drove away, the darkness outside seemed to press in even more. I couldn't stop thinking about the reflection I had seen in the glass. Had I imagined it? Or was there more to this nightmare than we had realized? Was the creature truly gone, or had we just been given a temporary reprieve? The truth was, I would never know. We never spoke about it again, not in any meaningful way. We tried to move on with our lives, but the memory of that night haunted us all. We went back to our normal routines, pretending that everything was fine. But something had changed within each of us. We were never the same again. Years later, long after we'd moved away from that town, I would still have nightmares. The same eyes, the same grin. And every time I closed my eyes, I would hear that voice, soft and distant, speaking words I could never quite understand. But the thing that haunted me the most wasn't the creature or the horrors we'd witnessed. It was the question that never left my mind. What if it wasn't really gone? I still think about the abandoned hospital, about the dark hallways, the flickering lights, and the strange, otherworldly presence that seemed to be watching us. I can't erase the memory of those eyes, the way they seemed to follow me even after we left. I can't help but ask myself, was it really over? Or was it just the beginning of something darker, something we couldn't escape? Over the years, I've heard rumors. People who went to the hospital after we did, those who dared to venture into its decaying halls, have said that the place still holds something not quite human. Some even claim they've seen figures moving through the windows at night, or heard strange noises echoing through the empty halls. I don't know if I believe them, but a part of me can't ignore the uneasy feeling that tightens in my chest when I think about it. I haven't returned to that place. I don't plan to. No matter how curious I get, no matter how much I wonder what lies beyond the hospital's walls, I know deep down that there are things in this world that are better left untouched. There are things that should remain forgotten, things that shouldn't be explored. I've learned that the hard way. Sometimes, ignorance is a blessing. I keep my distance from the old town now, though I still hear whispers about it from time to time. People talking about strange occurrences, unexplained sounds in the night. The hospital is still there, decaying slowly, but it still stands, as if waiting for the next group of foolish souls to walk through its doors. I wonder if anyone will ever truly understand what happened that night, what we saw, what we felt. But I doubt it. There are some things that can never be explained. Some things that are beyond our understanding. The truth is, I don't know if I'll ever truly be free from the memory. Maybe it's just a part of me now, something that I carry with me, like a scar that never fully heals. I still sometimes hear sounds late at night, the creak of floorboards, a faint whisper on the wind. And I wonder if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or if something is out there, still watching, still waiting. I don't think I'll ever find peace with it. I don't think I'll ever stop questioning what happened that night. But one thing is for certain, I will never, ever forget. And maybe, in the end, that's the real curse. The knowledge that something beyond our comprehension is out there, and that we were foolish enough to seek it out. I hope this story serves as a warning. If you ever hear of an abandoned hospital, an old, forgotten building that calls to you in the dead of night, don't go. Turn around, walk away, and never look back. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some things, once seen, will never leave you. So, as I sit here in the quiet of my room, I'll leave you with this final thought. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't the monster in the shadows or the ghost in the dark. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing is the question that lingers long after the danger is gone. The question that haunts your thoughts, that never lets you rest. Is it truly over? The answer, I think, is something I'll never know for sure. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all. It was a cold autumn evening when I found myself standing outside the crumbling gates of an old, forgotten amusement park. The kind of place that was once brimming with laughter and life, but now lay silent, overgrown with vines, and haunted by the echoes of its former glory. I had heard stories about the place, of course. It was a local legend, a spot whispered about by the townsfolk. Some said it was cursed, others that it was simply a place of misfortune. No one ever dared to go inside anymore, but I was different. As a child, I'd driven past this place countless times, peering out the window at the rusty Ferris wheel, the dilapidated carousel, and the shadows that seemed to stretch longer than the sun ever allowed. My friends and I had always dared each other to sneak inside, but we never did. It was the kind of thing you talk about, but never quite follow through with. Now, however, I was an adult grown, independent, and maybe a little reckless. The stories, the rumors, the strange occurrences, they all fueled my curiosity. I wanted to see it for myself. That evening, I wasn't alone. I had convinced two others to join me on this journey, although I didn't need much convincing. We were all in our 20s, trying to find some adventure away from our usual routines. We met at a small diner before heading over, laughing at the prospect of what lay ahead, as though it were just another normal night out. In retrospect, we were naive, thinking there was nothing more to it than simply walking through a forgotten place and snapping a few photos. The park was not far from town, a few miles outside the city limits, and the road leading up to it was lined with trees that seemed to close in on us as we drove further. Their twisted branches reached over the path like a canopy, casting long shadows across the road. We passed a few old houses here and there, their lights flickering in the distance, but it was mostly quiet, save for the hum of the tires on the asphalt. The air smelled faintly of mildew, a sure sign that the park had been abandoned for quite some time. I was driving, and my two companions sat silently in the back seat. We hadn't talked much during the drive. There was an unspoken tension in the air. The closer we got to the park, the more I could sense it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. I chalked it up to the darkening evening and the overactive imagination I had developed over the years. After all, we were just visiting an old, abandoned park. What harm could it really do? The gates of the amusement park loomed ahead as we neared our destination. They were tall, made of rusted iron, and the paint had long since peeled away, revealing the cold, unyielding metal beneath. A large sign hung above the gates, faded and cracked, reading Hollow Grove Amusement Park. I couldn't help but think how fitting the name was. Hollow. It seemed to embody everything about the place: empty, forsaken, forgotten by time. We parked the car just outside the gates and stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The park stretched out before us, an eerie expanse of broken rides, overgrown paths, and remnants of what used to be a place of joy. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, a skeletal figure against the night sky. It was hard to imagine that this place was ever full of laughter and excitement. It was as if all the joy had been drained from it, leaving only the hollow shell behind. We gathered our gear, flashlights, cameras, and a few snacks and approached the gates. The metal was cold to the touch, and there was an unsettling silence in the air. No wind, no animals scurrying about, nothing. Just an overwhelming stillness that seemed to weigh down on us. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a constant reminder that something was off. But we pressed on. As we stepped inside the park, the creaking of the gates echoed behind us. We were now officially in. The park seemed even more desolate up close. The asphalt paths were cracked, and weeds pushed through every gap, reclaiming what was once man-made. The carousel, once a bright and colorful fixture, was now a twisted collection of rusted metal horses frozen in mid-ride. The air smelled musty, and I could feel a chill in my bones, but I tried not to let it show. After all, this was just an abandoned park, right? We made our way down the main path, pointing out the remnants of old signs and broken structures. I found myself drawn to the old Ferris wheel, its rusted frame towering over the park like a ghost of its former self. There was something strangely captivating about it, even in its decayed state. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting. As we continued to explore, we came across a small ticket booth. It was barely standing, half collapsed with the roof sagging and the windows shattered. Inside, old ticket stubs and torn paper littered the ground. I knelt down to get a closer look, brushing the dust away from a forgotten ticket. The faded date on it was from the early 90s. It felt odd to hold something from so long ago. It was like touching the past itself, something that had been preserved in this place, suspended in time. We decided to continue exploring, though every step felt heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this place was more than just an abandoned park. Something about the silence, the way the air seemed thick with the weight of forgotten memories, unsettled me. But we kept moving forward. After all, we were here for adventure, and there was no turning back now. Little did we know, we were already beginning to uncover something far darker than we could have ever imagined. As we ventured deeper into the park, the stillness was palpable. There was no sound of birds or the rustling of leaves in the trees. Just a heavy silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. We walked through the twisted pathways, passing dilapidated booths and cracked pavement, all the while trying to convince ourselves that this was all just a forgotten amusement park, nothing more. Yet, that nagging feeling, that sense of unease, never fully left me. We passed a few more abandoned attractions, each one more haunting than the last. The bumper car arena was eerily quiet, the cars long since removed, leaving behind empty platforms covered in grime. The funhouse was dark, with its warped mirrors reflecting nothing but emptiness. There was something unsettling about how the mirrors seemed to reflect the darkness of the room, rather than the dim light from our flashlights. I tried to shake it off. It was just an old, run-down place, after all. But as we approached the old Ferris wheel again, something caught my eye. I had been looking around, taking in the wreckage, when I noticed something odd, a figure in the distance, standing at the base of the Ferris wheel. It was barely visible in the dim light, just a shadow among shadows. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it moved, slowly, methodically. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but there was a slight tremor in it. My heart started to race. The figure wasn't large or imposing, just a dark shape, but there was something about it that felt wrong. It wasn't a person, or at least not someone who belonged in a place like this. The others didn't seem to notice right away, but I pointed towards the Ferris wheel. "There's someone over there," I said. They followed my gaze, their flashlights wavering in their hands as they scanned the area. "What do you mean, someone?" One of them, Kyle, asked, his voice hesitant. He stepped closer to me, peering into the gloom. "I don't see anything." I felt my chest tighten, my stomach doing flips. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but I knew it wasn't right. The figure hadn't moved since I'd first noticed it. It was almost as if it was waiting, observing us. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck prickle. "I swear I saw something. Just over there," I said, trying to sound more certain. I wasn't about to admit I was losing my nerve. I looked again, but the figure was gone. The space where it had stood was empty, the shadows as thick and dark as ever. Kyle looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You okay? Maybe it's just your eyes playing tricks on you. It's pretty dark here." He paused, rubbing his chin as he stared at the Ferris wheel. "Could have been an animal or something, you know?" I nodded, though I didn't believe it. Animals didn't stand that still, not for as long as I had seen. but I kept it to myself, not wanting to make a bigger deal of it. Yeah, maybe. But let's keep moving. We started walking again, though I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. Every crackle of the overgrown grass underfoot seemed too loud, every creak of the rusted rides too sharp. My flashlight flickered briefly, and I couldn't help but jump at the sudden darkness before it flickered back on. I tried to focus on the others, on the conversation we were attempting to have, but my mind kept wandering back to that figure. What had it been? I couldn't stop the unease that crawled over my skin, like something was about to happen, like we had crossed a line we didn't know existed. Kyle broke the silence. So, what exactly are we looking for here? I mean, there's nothing really left, right? His voice was light, almost playful, but I could tell he was trying to fill the silence. He sounded more nervous than he wanted to admit. I couldn't help but agree with him. There was something about this place that didn't sit right. We weren't supposed to be here, and that sense of intrusion was growing stronger. It felt like we were trespassing on something much older than ourselves, something far beyond the crumbling attractions. But before I could answer, a loud bang echoed through the air. It was sharp, like something heavy had fallen or been struck with force. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came from behind the Ferris wheel, where the shadows were deepest. It had been sudden, unexpected, and it sent a wave of cold dread rushing over me. We all turned in unison, our flashlights cutting through the dark, but nothing was there. The noise had stopped as quickly as it had begun. There was no sign of movement, no rustling in the leaves, nothing. It was as if the park had swallowed the sound whole. What was that? Kyle asked, his voice strained now, less certain than before. I don't know, I said, my own voice shaking a little. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt like someone was out there. Something that wasn't happy we were here. My eyes kept darting back to the Ferris wheel, my thoughts swirling. We stood there in the silence for a few moments, each of us waiting for anything to happen. The air felt heavy, suffocating almost, as if the atmosphere itself was alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Maybe it's an animal, one of the others, Tom, suggested. He had the most grounded demeanor of the group, always the skeptic. Could be a raccoon or a bird or something. We're in the middle of nowhere. I didn't respond. My gut was telling me otherwise. The way the sound had echoed, so deliberate and loud, felt unnatural. And the fact that it had come from a place where there was no immediate reason for any sound to occur made it all the more unsettling. We should check it out, I said, though my voice was low and sure. I didn't want to, not really, but curiosity was getting the best of me. The others seemed hesitant but didn't argue. We made our way toward the Ferris wheel, the lights from our flashlights cutting through the shadows. Every step felt heavier, more deliberate, like we were being drawn into something we didn't understand. As we got closer, the hair on the back of my neck stood up again. The place felt different now. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt abandoned with a purpose. As though everything here was intentionally left to rot, to decay, to be forgotten. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. When we finally reached the Ferris wheel, the source of the noise was still unclear. There were no signs of movement, no broken pieces, no animals hiding in the shadows. Just the stillness, thick and oppressive. But I had a sinking feeling that something had been there. Something had been watching us. It wasn't until we turned to leave that I heard it again, a soft scrape, like something dragging across the ground. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Not a thing. We're leaving, I said, my voice firm now, a note of finality in it. The unease had become too much to ignore. The others didn't argue. There was no joke, no laughter now. We turned and made our way back down the path, my heart racing in my chest, my eyes scanning every corner of the park, as if the darkness itself might reach out to grab us. As we passed the remains of the carousel, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. But when I turned, there was nothing, only darkness. And that was when I knew we had disturbed something, something that didn't want to be disturbed. We continued walking down the cracked pathways, our footsteps echoing in the silence of the park. The sense of unease I had been feeling earlier wasn't fading. If anything, it was growing stronger. The distant whirring of wind through broken roller coaster tracks now felt like a warning. The sensation of being watched was impossible to shake. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, convinced that someone was following us. It wasn't just me, though. The others were on edge too. Kyle kept his hand on his flashlight, his knuckles white, and his eyes flicked nervously to every corner of the park. Tom, usually calm and logical, was unusually silent, his brow furrowed in concentration. The air had thickened, as if the park itself were holding its breath. "Okay, we need to figure out what's going on here," Kyle muttered, his voice low. "There's no way we're the only ones here. I don't care how quiet it's been, something's off." Tom nodded, though he didn't say anything at first. He seemed lost in thought. I was relieved to see that I wasn't the only one feeling the weight of the place pressing in on us. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional creak of metal or the dry rustle of leaves in the breeze. We had passed by the old haunted house a few moments earlier, but it was still fresh in my mind. I hadn't liked it one bit. The place looked untouched, yet everything about it felt wrong. Its facade, dark and weathered, almost seemed to leer at us from the edge of the path, the windows like hollow eyes watching every move. That feeling of being observed had intensified when we passed by it, but none of us had dared to speak up. Now, Tom's voice broke through the quiet once more. "You guys feel that? Something's just off." His tone was uncharacteristically hesitant, a crack in his usual bravado. "I've been saying that since we got here," I responded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice, but failing miserably. "Let's just check the damn place out. If there's something we're missing, now's the time." There was an uncomfortable pause, but eventually we made our way back to the haunted house. With every step I took, I could feel the hairs on my arms rising. The air seemed colder around the house, and the weight of the silence was unbearable. We stood at the entrance, the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. It had been left open, as though someone or something had invited us inside. "Should we really go in?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you scared?" Tom teased, but it was obvious from his body language that he wasn't entirely sure himself. We all hesitated. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. Whatever was happening, whatever was out there, I couldn't just ignore it. We couldn't leave without answers. I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges making my stomach drop. The smell hit us first, musty, stale air, like something had been rotting inside for years. The darkness beyond the door was thick, almost impenetrable, but we stepped forward, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The sound of our footsteps was unnaturally loud, every small noise echoing through the empty corridors. Inside, the walls were covered in peeling paint, the floor littered with broken glass and decaying remnants of what once had been carnival-themed decorations. Faded posters clung to the walls, advertising long-forgotten attractions. The air felt thick, oppressive. Every corner we turned, I half expected to see someone lurking in the shadows, waiting to jump out at us. Then it happened. As we moved deeper into the house, there was a sound, faint but unmistakable. A soft scraping, like fingernails dragging against wood. I froze. My flashlight quivered in my hand, and for a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then it happened again. Louder this time. Scrape. Scrape. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice tight. Kyle was already moving toward the source of the noise, his flashlight aimed at the corner of the room. "Probably just the place settling," he said, though there was a nervous edge to his voice. He took another step, and the noise stopped. Dead silence followed. It was like the house had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for us to make our next move. But that silence didn't last. From the far end of the room came a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle, like someone or something was dragging itself along the floor. I couldn't see anything, but the noise was unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. I glanced at Tom, his face pale as he stood frozen in place, his hand gripping his flashlight so hard his knuckles were white. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice shaking. But before we could turn to leave, a loud crash echoed from behind us, the sound of something heavy falling to the ground. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just empty space and shadows. My pulse hammered in my throat, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. "We're not alone," Kyle said, his voice barely audible, but there was a certainty in it that sent a chill through me. I looked at him, and for the first time since we had entered the house, I saw the fear in his eyes. We began moving faster now, my heart thudding against my chest as I tried to focus on anything but the growing sense of dread that seemed to fill the room. The air was thick with it, every breath tasting like dust and decay. We reached the door, but just as I reached for the handle, something made me pause. A faint light flickered in the corner of my eye. I turned, and there it was, the faintest outline of a figure, just beyond the doorway we had just passed through. My stomach dropped, my body frozen in place. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it. I could feel its presence, a heavy weight in the air that seemed to press against me from all sides. Then, in a blink, it was gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the shadows. "Let's go," I urged, my voice urgent now. Right now. The others didn't need any convincing. We bolted from the house, the door slamming shut behind us as if something had been holding it open just for us to leave. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life, the terror propelling us forward. We didn't stop until we reached the main path again, gasping for breath, hearts racing, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. But as we stood there, panting, trying to steady ourselves, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it only grew stronger. I turned, my eyes scanning the park, but there was no one. Nothing. But the air was thick with something unspoken, something ancient, something that didn't belong in a forgotten amusement park. We weren't alone. That much was clear. But the question now was, what did it want from us? The air was colder now, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones and made every inch of you feel exposed. We had left the haunted house behind, but the unsettling sensation that something was waiting, lurking in the shadows, never let up. Our pace had quickened, but no matter how fast we moved, the oppressive weight of the place seemed to follow us. "Guys, we need to get out of here," Kyle said, his voice strained. "Now, I don't care how long it takes to get back to the car, but we need to leave." I couldn't argue with him. I was already on the verge of panic, my mind racing as the shadows seemed to stretch and distort around us. The further we walked, the darker the park became, even though the sun had barely dipped below the horizon. The dull, fading light from the distant buildings barely penetrated the gloom, casting everything in an eerie, dim glow. Something was wrong. I had tried to rationalize it, all there had to be an explanation for everything we'd seen. But now, as we stood at the edge of the Ferris wheel, looking out across the empty park, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been walking straight into a trap. The wind had picked up, and the creaking of metal and wood filled the air like a warning bell. We all stood there in a tense silence, the only sound the groaning of the Ferris wheel turning slowly, almost unnaturally, like it was being pushed by unseen hands. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. Tom was staring at it, his body frozen as if rooted to the spot. "Do you guys hear that?" Tom's voice was a whisper, barely audible above the noise of the wind. I had been hearing it for a while, but now that he mentioned it, the sound was clearer. It was a low hum, almost like a machine running in the distance, but there was something unnatural about it. It didn't sound like any normal engine or motor. It felt alive, as if the park itself was breathing. "What is that?" Kyle asked, his voice tight, though he didn't take his eyes off the Ferris wheel. Before any of us could respond, the hum grew louder, more pronounced, until it filled the entire park. The wind whipped around us, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw something move in the shadows, something large, something human-shaped, but twisted, distorted. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The feeling in my chest tightened. Something wasn't right. Not only did I feel like we weren't alone, but whatever was here, it wasn't human. It was as if we were being hunted, toyed with. The sense of dread was now so thick that it was almost suffocating. And then it happened. The ground beneath us trembled, just slightly at first, as if the earth itself was stirring. We froze, eyes wide. The trembling increased, the ground vibrating beneath our feet, and then a crash. The sound of something heavy falling, followed by the unmistakable grinding of metal against stone. I looked around, trying to make sense of it, but there was no explanation. No visible cause. "Run!" Kyle shouted suddenly, his eyes wide with terror. He grabbed my arm, yanking me away from the Ferris wheel. "Now!" We ran, but the sounds followed us, the metal creaking, the hum growing louder, and the air growing thicker with every step. We stumbled forward, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know how far we ran, but when I glanced back, I could see the Ferris wheel in the distance, still spinning slowly, its creaking now deafening. And then, just as I thought we were safe, we heard it scream. A high-pitched, inhuman scream that ripped through the silence, sending a chill down my spine. It wasn't human. I turned, and there it was. A figure, tall and hunched, emerging from the shadows near the old carousel. Its limbs were elongated, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. The thing was impossibly thin, but its eyes, those eyes were wide and glowing with a sickly yellow light. The creature's mouth was gaping open, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. The scream came again, and this time it was closer. Tom had stopped in his tracks, his eyes locked on the thing. He was frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. I wanted to scream at him to move, but my own body wouldn't respond. The thing's gaze locked onto Tom, and in that instant, I saw the terror in his eyes. He didn't stand a chance. Before we could even react, the creature lunged. Tom screamed as the creature's elongated hand shot out, its fingers curling around his arm like claws. It yanked him toward it, pulling him effortlessly from the ground. His feet scrambled, but there was no escaping its grip. The creature's face twisted into a grotesque grin, its teeth gleaming in the fading light. "No, Tom!" I screamed, but Kyle was already pulling me away. "We can't help him," he shouted. "We need to get out of here." But I couldn't. I couldn't leave Tom. My feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sight of him, struggling against the thing's grip, his face contorted in agony as he screamed for help. The creature's grin widened, and it leaned in close, its breath hot and fetid as it whispered something in Tom's ear. It was too late. With a sickening crack, the creature's other hand reached out, and in a single, brutal motion, it wrenched Tom's head back. The snap of his neck echoed in the stillness, a sound I would never forget. Kyle pulled me away with all his strength, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. It turned toward us, its eyes glowing even brighter now, its grin widening as if it reveled in our fear. It was then I realized this was no abandoned amusement park. This place was a trap, a living nightmare, a place where the spirits of those who had vanished over the years had been twisted into something else. And we were its next victims. In the back of my mind, I could still hear Tom scream, even though I knew he was gone. I could feel the weight of his absence pressing down on me, but there was no time to mourn. The creature was still watching us. We ran without looking back. And as we reached the exit, the last thing I saw was the Ferris wheel, spinning faster and faster, as if it were alive, feeding on our fear. And then we were gone. The park loomed behind us, a dark silhouette against the dimming sky. My chest heaved with every breath as Kyle and I sprinted toward the fence that separated the old amusement park from the outside world. We didn't look back, not even once. Our only focus was the exit, the promise of safety that seemed to be slipping further away the longer we ran. But I couldn't shake the image of Tom's face, his eyes wide in terror as the creature tore him apart. I had to believe it was a nightmare, that it wasn't real, but deep down, I knew it was. I knew something had changed in that place. The park had become something more than just abandoned. It had become a living entity, hungry for those who dared enter. I glanced at Kyle, his face pale and covered in a sheen of sweat. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes were focused on the path ahead. His gaze never wavered, and I realized then that he was just as scared as I was, if not more. "We need to get to the car. We need to go. Now." Kyle's voice was tight, almost strangled. There was no arguing with him. The terror was written all over his face, his hands trembling as he gripped the fence and tried to hoist himself over it. I did the same, my mind numb, my limbs heavy from the adrenaline still coursing through me. When we reached the other side, we didn't stop. We didn't look back. We just ran, running like we had never run before. It felt like we were racing against time itself, trying to outrun the horrors we had just witnessed. The echo of Tom's scream still rang in my ears. It took us what felt like hours to reach the parking lot, but when we finally did, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. The car was still there, untouched, as if it had been waiting for us all this time. Kyle fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the door. I climbed in without a word, the world outside the car now a blur of motion as he sped away from the park. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled to process what had just happened. Tom was gone. The creature was real. And that park, that place, was more than just an old amusement park. It was a doorway to something ancient, something sinister. "I can't believe it," Kyle said, his voice low. "I can't believe what just happened." "I don't think it's over," I muttered, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, though I wasn't really seeing it. "I don't think we're free." We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing more to say. Every once in a while, I'd glance at Kyle, and I could see the fear in his eyes. We both knew that what we had just witnessed wasn't something that could be forgotten easily. And the fact that we were still alive didn't make me feel safe. It made me feel worse. When we finally got home, there was a sense of eerie stillness in the air, as if the world itself had paused for a moment, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what time it was. The drive had taken longer than I thought, and the darkness had consumed everything around us. Kyle parked the car in the driveway, and we sat there for a moment, both of us still caught in the aftershocks of the night. We hadn't said a word since we'd left the park, but the tension in the air was thick. "I don't think we can tell anyone about this," Kyle said quietly, breaking the silence. "No one would believe us." "Doesn't matter," I replied, staring straight ahead. "Even if we tell someone, what can they do? The park, whatever it was, it's still out there." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The reality of what had happened was starting to settle in. We had survived, but Tom hadn't. The creature was still out there, still watching. And whatever dark force had awakened in that park, it wasn't done with us. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to think about it, to face the fact that we might not have been the only ones the park had claimed. But something in the back of my mind told me that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "You know what's strange?" I asked, breaking the silence again. Kyle turned to me, his eyes wary, almost reluctant to hear what I had to say. "What?" "The Ferris wheel," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't think it ever stopped." Kyle's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the last time we looked back," I continued, my voice trembling now. "It was still spinning. But it wasn't just spinning. It was moving. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like it was alive, like it was drawing us back in. I swear it was. Waiting." The silence that followed was suffocating. It felt like the world outside had disappeared, like we were the last two people alive, trapped in a moment that was slipping further away with each passing second. Kyle didn't respond. He just stared out the windshield, his eyes distant. We sat there for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say or how to make sense of the horror we had just escaped. As I finally got out of the car and walked toward the house, my thoughts raced. I had thought that if I left, if I went home, everything would be over. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. There was a lingering presence, something that had followed us, something that wasn't finished with us yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the park came back for us. And when it did, I wasn't sure we'd survive it a second time. The front door clicked shut behind me, and I could still hear the hum in my head, that low, constant noise, as if something was waiting just beyond the edge of my reality. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The park, the creature, Tom's face, those images haunted me long after the terror of the chase had ended. Kyle called me the next morning. His voice was tight, nervous. He hadn't slept either. Neither of us had been able to shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting. We didn't talk about the park anymore. We didn't even bring it up. It's been years since that night. Years, yet I still can't shake the memory of the abandoned amusement park, the sound of the Ferris wheel creaking, the screech of its rusted frame as it spun endlessly in the dark. It doesn't matter how many miles I put between myself and that place, the memories are etched in my mind, as vivid and haunting as ever. I never saw Kyle again after that night. We both tried to move on, tried to bury what we'd experienced under the weight of everyday life. But the park, that cursed place, followed us. Not physically, but in ways that I can't explain. I still hear the whispers, the low hum that seems to float just outside my reach. I can't tell if it's my mind playing tricks on me, or if there's something truly lingering in the world that we can't understand. I sometimes wonder if Kyle remembers it the same way I do. Does he wake up at night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, wondering if it was all just a nightmare? Or does he feel the pull of that place too, just like I do? In the years since, I've tried to forget. I've tried to convince myself that it was just an illusion, that what happened that night was the result of too much fear, too much adrenaline. But deep down, I know that isn't true. I know what I saw. I know what we both saw. And what I can't shake, what I can't escape, is the feeling that we were never meant to leave that park alive. That somehow, we escaped because it wanted us to. I moved away, started a new life, left the past behind as much as I could. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the creaking of the Ferris wheel. I still hear the rustle of the wind through the empty, decaying carnival tents. The laughter of children long since gone. And I know, somewhere deep inside, that if I ever went back, that place would still be there, waiting for me. I've heard rumors about the park in the years since. People say they've seen lights flicker in the distance, strange shapes moving through the abandoned rides, the echo of laughter on the wind. I don't know if I believe those stories, but I also know one thing. I'm not foolish enough to test it. It's strange though. There's a part of me that still wonders if the park is still calling to me. What if it wasn't just an accident? What if there's something more to it, something that goes beyond what we can understand? The idea that there's a force, a dark energy, living within those gates, pulling people toward it, trapping them in its grasp, it's hard to ignore. But maybe it's better that I don't go back. Maybe it's safer to leave it behind. Maybe the park has a hold on me, just as it had a hold on Tom. I can't be sure. All I know is that I was lucky to escape. And sometimes, luck is all we have. There's a part of me that wonders if it will ever truly be over. If it will follow me, haunt me, like some twisted version of a childhood memory. A place that once promised fun, adventure, and laughter, but now serves as a reminder that some things in this world should never be touched, never be explored. So, I'll keep moving forward. I'll keep living my life, but I'll always be haunted by that place. The Ferris wheel, the laughter, the darkness that seemed to crawl out of the shadows, twisting and turning, reaching for us. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of it. Maybe no one ever is once they've crossed the threshold. And maybe that's the real horror of it, the way the past never truly lets go, the way it follows us even when we think we're safe. It was a chilly autumn night, one of those nights where the cold air seemed to settle deep into your bones. The kind of night where you find yourself pulling your coat tighter around you, even if you're just waiting for a bus. I was standing at the bus stop, watching the dim streetlights flicker in the fog, my breath clouding in front of me. It wasn't the first time I'd caught the late bus, but there was something different about that night. You see, it had been a long day at work. I was tired, the kind of tired that seeps into your bones and makes every step feel heavier than the last. But I still had to make my way home. The last bus of the night was my only option, and I knew I would get there eventually, even if it meant an hour or so of half sleep on the ride. The bus stop was in a quiet part of town, far from the busy streets and neon lights. Most people avoided this area, especially after dark. The street I was on was lined with old brick buildings, some of them abandoned, others barely clinging to life. It wasn't a place you'd usually find someone walking alone after sunset. But there I was, standing in the cold, waiting for that tired old bus to show up. As I stood there, a few things crossed my mind. I thought about how quiet it was. No traffic, no other people, just me and the streetlights, flickering in the distance. It felt almost too quiet, like the world around me was holding its breath, waiting for something. I shook the thought from my head. I was just tired, right? The world was always quiet at night. The bus stop was small, just a wooden bench and a sign that had seen better days. The light above the bench buzzed intermittently, casting strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I glanced at my watch. The bus was running late, no surprise there. The last few weeks, it had been arriving later and later, making me wonder if the bus company had cut back on routes. I wasn't the only one waiting. A man was standing a few feet away, leaning against the lamppost. He didn't look out of place, just a man in a long coat, probably waiting for the same bus. He had his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and his head was bowed, making it hard to make out his face. But something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he stood there, like he didn't belong, or maybe it was the fact that he hadn't moved a muscle since I first noticed him. But I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, who was I to judge? The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty street as I paced back and forth, glancing down at my phone, trying to kill time. It was then that I noticed the street seemed even quieter than before. Not a single car had passed, and the wind had died down to a faint whisper. The world seemed to be holding its breath, just like earlier. And then, in the distance, I saw the bus lights. The bus, at last. I sighed in relief and stepped forward, eager to finally get home. As I walked toward the stop, I noticed that the man who had been standing by the lamppost was gone. It was strange, considering he hadn't moved a single inch for the entire time I'd been there. But it wasn't the first odd thing I'd noticed that night, and I didn't pay it much thought. The bus was more important now. When the bus arrived, it didn't pull up to the stop like it usually did. Instead, it seemed to slow down gradually before coming to a stop just a few feet away from the bench. The doors creaked open, and the driver, an older man, his face obscured by shadow, gave me a quick nod as I climbed aboard. I took a seat near the middle of the bus dimly lit by overhead lights, casting long shadows across the worn upholstery. As the bus pulled away from the stop, I felt a sense of unease creeping in, but I dismissed it. It was just a late-night bus ride, nothing more. Or so I thought. Little did I know, this ride was going to be far from ordinary. The bus hummed quietly as it rumbled down the empty streets, its headlights cutting through the misty night. The glow of the streetlights outside cast eerie shadows against the windows, making everything feel like a scene from a movie you didn't want to be part of. I settled into my seat, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that had started to creep up on me. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the strange quietness of the night, or the fact that the bus was practically empty. It was more than that. It was like the air itself was thicker, heavier, as though it was pressing down on me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. not in the way I was used to. The bus itself was old, one of those models that had seen better days. The vinyl seats were cracked, and the windows didn't seal properly, letting in the faint chill of the night air. I could hear the low hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the brakes. The driver, a grizzled man with a face I couldn't make out, seemed to be lost in his own world, his hands firmly gripping the wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead. There were only a handful of people on the bus, mostly people like me, riding late at night, trying to get home after a long day. But something was off about this ride. I could feel it in my bones. As the bus continued down the road, I started to notice small details that felt out of place. The air was colder than it should have been, and the dim light from the overhead bulbs flickered intermittently, casting odd, shifting shadows on the walls. I looked around at the few passengers who were scattered throughout the bus, their faces drawn and tired, their eyes glazed over with exhaustion. But one passenger stood out. He was sitting near the front, on the opposite side of the aisle from me. At first, I thought he was just another tired commuter, someone who'd had a long day and was ready to go home. But then I noticed something strange. His movements were stiff, almost unnatural. His hands were clasped tightly together in his lap, and he kept glancing nervously at the rearview mirror, as if he was watching something or someone behind him. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I quickly dismissed it. It was late, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. Still, the feeling lingered. The bus stopped at a few more corners, picking up more passengers, but the man at the front remained still, his eyes darting around the bus nervously. It was hard to ignore him now. The air in the bus felt even heavier, as though the weight of something unseen was pressing down on us. The other passengers didn't seem to notice. They were lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the tension that seemed to grow with every passing minute. Then, it happened. The bus slowed to a crawl as we approached another stop, the brake lights flashing red in the dim light. As the bus drew closer to the curb, I heard a faint but unmistakable sound, a low, guttural scraping noise, like metal on metal. It was a sound that immediately made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced toward the front of the bus, and that's when I saw it. The driver's face, which had been mostly obscured in shadow, was now illuminated by the streetlights outside. His expression was strange, almost blank. His hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. But what really caught my attention was the way his eyes were fixed on something in the distance, as if he was staring at something or someone that wasn't there. The scraping noise grew louder, and I could see the passengers around me start to stir, looking up from their phones or books. The man at the front of the bus shifted in his seat, his body tensing up as though he were preparing for something. The bus continued to slow, but then it jerked violently, as though something had gripped it from the outside and shaken it. The driver didn't seem to react, his eyes still fixed on that distant point. For a split second, the entire bus felt like it was suspended in time, as though the world outside had frozen, and all that remained was the eerie noise that continued to scrape against the air. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and made my way toward the front of the bus. The strange man at the front was still staring ahead, his body stiff and unmoving. I stopped a few feet away from him, unsure of what to say or do. But then, just as I was about to speak, the bus jolted again, this time harder than before. The lights flickered wildly, and the bus screeched to a halt. The scraping sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind a sudden, deafening silence. I stood there, breathless, staring at the man in front of me. He was still staring ahead, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open, but there was no sign of recognition. It was as if he hadn't noticed anything strange at all. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The other passengers didn't respond immediately, as though they hadn't even heard me. A woman sitting near the back of the bus, her face pale and drawn, slowly turned to me. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. I took a step closer to her, unsure of what to say. "What's going on?" I asked again. this time more urgently. The silence was unbearable. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It's him, the driver. Something's wrong with him." Her voice trailed off, and she quickly turned away, pressing her hand to her mouth as though she were trying to hold back a scream. I looked toward the front of the bus again. The driver's face was still blank, his eyes staring ahead, unblinking. But now, I noticed something else, something that made my stomach churn. There was a faint, dark shadow behind him, barely visible in the dim light, but there nonetheless. It was moving. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what I was seeing, but I knew one thing for sure: something was terribly wrong. Before I could react, the bus jolted again, and the lights flickered out completely. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then, a single word echoed through the bus, a word that chilled me to the core. "Run!" The moment the lights went out, it felt as though the entire bus had fallen into another dimension, a place where the usual rules no longer applied. The sudden darkness was suffocating, enveloping the bus in an oppressive, unnatural silence. The only sound that could be heard was the rhythmic thumping of my own heartbeat as it pounded in my ears. I could barely make out anything in the pitch-black void around me. The cold air, which had been hanging heavily in the bus, now felt even colder, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was the kind of darkness that made you feel as though you weren't alone, even though you knew no one else had moved. I could hear the faint shuffle of feet as passengers adjusted themselves in their seats, probably just as disoriented as I was. The stillness was broken only by the faint murmur of voices, low and hushed, as though everyone was afraid to speak too loudly. I strained my eyes, trying to make out anything at all, but it was impossible. My mind raced, trying to grasp some semblance of reason in the midst of the madness. What had happened? Where were the lights? The bus had come to a stop, but it was as though we were suspended in time, floating in the darkness, with no clear sense of direction. Was this a power failure? But why hadn't the driver done anything? Why was there still no movement? Why did it feel like we were waiting for something? Then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered back on, casting a harsh, sterile glow over everything, and the bus seemed to lurch back to life. But it wasn't the same. The atmosphere had changed. The air was colder, and it felt heavier, as if a shadow had fallen over the place, making everything feel off, unnatural. My heart rate quickened. I glanced around, my eyes searching desperately for anything that might explain what was going on. The passengers were all still there, sitting quietly, but there was an odd tension in the air. No one was speaking. No one was moving. And the man at the front, the one who had been acting so strange before, he was still staring ahead, his hands still clasped tightly together in his lap. It was as though he hadn't noticed the strange events around us, as though he was locked in some other world of his own. The driver, too, hadn't moved. His expression was still blank, his eyes glued to the road ahead. But something about his stillness sent a ripple of unease through me. It wasn't just that he hadn't reacted to the power failure or the strange noises. It was the way his hands were gripping the steering wheel, as though he were trying to hold onto something or keep something from happening. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me as I made my way toward the front of the bus. I was careful not to make too much noise, my footsteps muffled by the faint hum of the bus's engine. As I approached the front, the tension in the air became almost palpable. I felt like I was walking into a pressure cooker, where everything was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't quite comprehend. When I reached the front, I was close enough to see the driver more clearly. His face was still fixed, blank, as though he were in a trance. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared ahead, and there was a faint, twitching smile on his lips, something that made my skin crawl. It was unnatural, like something had taken hold of him, something that wasn't entirely human. "Hey," I said, my voice breaking the silence. "Are you all right?" No response. I leaned in closer, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know why I was so desperate to get an answer, but I was. Something in me told me that if I didn't get an answer, I might never get the chance again. The man at the front didn't even acknowledge me. He just kept staring ahead, his grip tightening on the wheel. His fingers were so white I could see the bones beneath the skin, and his body was stiff, as though he had frozen in place. I took another step forward, closer to the driver's seat. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand. That's when it happened. The faint scraping sound, the one that had first made my skin crawl, began again. This time, it was louder, sharper, as if it was coming from inside the bus. It was like fingernails on glass, dragging slowly and steadily. I froze, my entire body tensing as the noise filled the space, echoing in the hollow silence. I whipped around, searching for the source, but I couldn't see anything. The other passengers were still sitting motionless in their seats, their eyes wide, but they didn't seem to hear it. Or if they did, they weren't reacting. It was as if they were trapped in some kind of trance, unable or unwilling to move. The scraping continued, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was getting closer, closer to me. I could feel it, like it was drawing near, inch by agonizing inch. I spun around again, trying to see if anyone else was noticing, but the other passengers were still frozen in place, their faces pale and blank, as though they were in a daze. That's when I saw a shadow moving across the floor of the bus. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but as I stared, it grew more distinct. A dark, shifting mass that slithered across the aisle, stretching and contracting like it was searching for something, moving with purpose. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away from whatever this was, but my feet refused to move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow as it crept closer, slowly and deliberately, towards the front of the bus. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. My senses were on high alert, every nerve tingling with the awareness that something terrible was happening. Something beyond explanation. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, and I couldn't breathe. The scraping noise intensified, becoming louder, sharper, more urgent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The bus came to a sudden, jarring halt, throwing me off balance. I stumbled backward into a seat, my hands gripping the armrests, my breath shallow and ragged. The world around me felt off. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I glanced at the other passengers. They were all still sitting motionless, their eyes vacant, as though they were lost in a trance, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the growing horror around them. I looked back to the front of the bus, and that's when I saw it. The driver's face. It wasn't just blank anymore. It was smiling, and it wasn't a smile I'd ever seen before. It wasn't human. It was something else. The moment I saw the driver's smile, everything shifted. It was as though the world itself had bent at an unnatural angle, throwing me into a state of complete terror. His lips curled upward slowly, far too slowly for a natural expression. The smile didn't reach his eyes, and it felt wrong, like a mask had been pulled over his face, a mask that didn't belong there. There was something hollow about it, empty. It was a grotesque caricature of happiness, something that shouldn't have existed, and yet, here it was, staring back at me. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my throat closing up as the air around me grew thick with a sense of impending doom. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. The driver, his twisted grin still plastered on his face, didn't move. He just sat there, staring ahead, his hands still gripping the wheel with an unnerving intensity. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the bus, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt trapped, as if the very air itself was holding me in place. I turned my head, desperately searching for some sign that the other passengers were seeing what I was seeing, that they were aware of the strange, terrifying things happening around us. But they weren't. The passengers were all still sitting motionless in their seats, their eyes glazed over, staring at nothing. It was as though they were in a trance, completely oblivious to the horrors unfolding right in front of them. The silence was unbearable. The only sound that filled the bus was the low hum of the engine, but even that felt distant, like it was coming from a world that no longer existed. The bus had stopped moving, but it was as if time had stopped altogether. I looked out the window, hoping for a glimpse of the outside world, anything that could reassure me that this was all just a nightmare. But all I saw was darkness, a void, nothingness. The shadow I had seen earlier, the one slithering across the floor of the bus, was back. It was crawling towards me, moving with a slow, deliberate pace, its form shifting and contorting in unnatural ways. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was alive, and it was coming closer. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat as I slowly backed away, my legs trembling beneath me. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice had betrayed me. It wouldn't come. I could feel my body shaking, my mind spiraling out of control as the shadow grew closer, inch by agonizing inch. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the scraping sound returned. It was louder now, more urgent. The nails dragging across glass, the horrible screeching that made my skin crawl. It felt as if the walls of the bus were closing in on me, the noise reverberating through the metal and glass, growing louder, more overwhelming with each passing second. I turned, desperate to find an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The aisles were too narrow, the doors locked. The windows were sealed shut, trapping me inside with whatever this thing was. The shadow was now right in front of me, its tendrils reaching out, stretching toward me like something alive. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was a presence, something that had been lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of fear, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing in front of me. And then it spoke. Not with words, not in any way I could understand, but with a sound, a low, guttural noise that reverberated through the very core of my being. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, that sent waves of terror crashing over me. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries to be unleashed. And it was speaking to me, calling to me in a language that was beyond comprehension. I could feel it inside my head, burrowing into my thoughts, filling every crevice with its darkness. It was reaching into my mind, pulling at my memories, my fears, everything I had ever known, distorting it, warping it into something else. I tried to block it out, to fight against it, but it was too strong. It was too powerful. The more I struggled, the tighter its grip became. And then I felt it. Cold fingers, icy and sharp, wrap around my wrist. The sensation was so real, so tangible, that I screamed out in terror. I looked down, and there, in the darkness, was a hand. No, not a hand, but something far worse. It was like a mass of shadows, tendrils of darkness that twisted and writhed like serpents, reaching out to claim me. I tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, pulling me closer, dragging me toward the thing. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struggled, as I fought with everything I had. But it was no use. The shadow was stronger, and it was pulling me into its embrace. I looked to the front of the bus, desperate for some kind of help, but the driver's face had changed. The smile was gone, replaced by something far worse. His eyes were black, empty voids, hollow and soulless. And that smile, it had spread. It wasn't just on his lips anymore. It had consumed his entire face, distorting it into a grotesque mask of terror. The thing in the shadows began to whisper again, that same guttural noise filling my mind, and I could feel myself slipping. My vision blurred, my senses overwhelmed by the overwhelming presence of whatever this thing was. My mind was breaking, unraveling in the face of this unimaginable horror. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the shadows retreated. The grip on my wrist loosened, and the whispers stopped. The bus was still, eerily so. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. The world around me felt distorted, broken. The passengers were still frozen, their faces pale and lifeless. The driver, he hadn't moved. He was still staring ahead, his eyes black as night. The air in the bus had thickened, heavy with a tension I couldn't shake. I was still frozen in place, my hand clutching the edge of my seat like it might be the only thing keeping me tethered to this reality. The shadows had receded, but they hadn't disappeared. They were there, in the corners of my vision, in the very fabric of the bus. It felt like a lingering, oppressive force, and I knew deep down that it hadn't truly left. I tried to move. My legs were shaking, but I had to escape. Whatever had happened, whatever had come over me in that moment, I couldn't stay here. The fear was overwhelming, but it was the uncertainty, the unknown, that gnawed at my mind the most. I had to get off this bus. I had to leave, no matter what. I reached for the door, hands trembling, but it didn't budge. The bus wasn't stopping. I pounded my fist against the window, desperation bubbling up in my chest. The outside world was just as dark as before, stretching out endlessly, with no sign of life, no sign of anything that could offer me solace. I could hear nothing but my frantic breathing, the pounding of my heart, and the unrelenting hum of the bus's engine. I looked around, searching for anyone who might have noticed what had happened. The passengers were still there, frozen, lifeless. Their eyes didn't move, their heads didn't turn. They were statues, mere husks, their bodies occupying space, but their souls nowhere to be found. It was like they weren't even people anymore. It was as if the thing in the shadows had already claimed them, just like it had tried to claim me. My eyes moved to the driver, and that same chill crawled up my spine. He hadn't moved, not a single muscle. His face was still that grotesque, smiling mask. The darkness in his eyes hadn't receded. It was still there, staring at me, into me. I couldn't take it any longer. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. And yet, it was. I couldn't tell if I was hallucinating or if what I had experienced was real. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred so much that I wasn't sure what to believe. But in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay here any longer. I stumbled down the aisle, the sound of my footsteps unnervingly loud in the stillness. It felt as though the very act of walking was an intrusion into the silence, as though I was disturbing something ancient, something that had been waiting in the dark for far longer than I could comprehend. Each step felt like it was leading me deeper into something I could not understand. Reaching the front of the bus, I pressed myself against the door, trying once more to force it open. It didn't give. I hammered on the glass, my knuckles raw and bruised, but it wouldn't open. My mind was spinning. Was I locked in? Trapped in this nightmare with no way out? And then I heard it, the low, guttural growl again. This time, it came from inside the bus, from the darkness that hung over us all. It wasn't the shadow anymore. It wasn't the whispers or the tendrils that had tried to pull me under. This was something else. This was something that had been waiting, something that had been feeding on the fear, on the uncertainty, on the terror of the passengers. I turned, half expecting to see the shadow come for me again, but this time it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, one that seemed to materialize from the very air itself. It was tall, thin, its body barely more than a silhouette, its limbs unnaturally long and contorted. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, as if they were made of pure darkness. And its mouth, oh, its mouth. It stretched too wide, far too wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to go on forever, filling its face, consuming it. The figure moved toward me, and I could feel the air grow colder with every step it took. The others on the bus didn't react. They were still as statues, unaffected, detached from the horror that was unfolding before me. but I couldn't look away. I couldn't take my eyes off the thing that was coming for me, inch by agonizing inch. I stumbled back, falling into a seat. My heart raced. Sweat poured down my face as I tried to control my breathing. This was real. This was happening. There was no escaping it. But then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't just sit here and let it claim me like it had claimed the others. With a surge of adrenaline, I bolted for the emergency exit. I didn't care what happened. I didn't care what the figure or the bus driver or the shadows wanted. I had to get out. I had to survive. My hands were shaking as I pulled the lever, the door finally giving way with a groan. I could hear the thing behind me, its footsteps growing louder as it closed in. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I threw myself out of the door and onto the ground, gasping for air as I scrambled away. I don't know how long I ran. The world around me was a blur, the darkness swallowing everything whole. My heart was pounding in my chest as I ran, legs burning with every step, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. I had to get as far away from that bus as possible. Finally, I collapsed on the side of the road, exhausted and out of breath. My body shook violently, not just from the physical exertion, but from the overwhelming fear that still clung to me. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but there was nothing. No lights, no houses, just endless, dark road stretching into nothingness. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't care. I had made it out. I had escaped. But even as I lay there, gasping for breath, I could feel the weight of something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened again. I didn't know if I had truly escaped, if the nightmare had really ended. Because deep down, I knew that whatever I had encountered on that bus, it wasn't over. It was still out there, waiting, watching, and I was no safer than I had been before. The bus had disappeared when I looked back. There was no sign of it. It was gone, as if it had never existed. But I knew the truth. It had been real. And whatever had happened, whatever had been happening on that bus, it wasn't over. The night was eerily quiet, so silent it felt as though the world had stopped turning. I sat there on the side of the road, my mind racing, desperately trying to process everything that had happened. My body was still trembling, every muscle exhausted from the fight or flight response that had kept me moving for what felt like hours. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was over, I knew deep down that I had only escaped one chapter of this nightmare. I glanced around, the empty road stretching endlessly into the darkness. No cars passed by, no lights in the distance, no sign of civilization. It was as though I had fallen off the map. Had the bus taken me somewhere far from where I had boarded? Or was it something more sinister, something that had made this entire place feel so wrong? The darkness wasn't just a lack of light, it was thick, oppressive, as if it had weight in substance. I pulled myself to my feet, my legs shaky, and began walking along the side of the road. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. Not on that desolate stretch of nothingness. The fear was still there, clawing at the edges of my thoughts, but it was joined by an overwhelming sense of isolation. The silence was too much to bear. The absence of life, of noise, was a reminder that I might not be as free as I thought. I tried to remember everything that had happened, but the details kept slipping away. I could still see the face of the driver, twisted in that unnatural smile. The figures on the bus, unmoving, staring. The shadows that seemed to twist and stretch. But it felt like a dream now. A bad dream. Something I would wake from. Something I could shake off if I just kept moving. If I just kept putting one foot in front of the other. But I had already learned that some dreams didn't end when you woke up. The more I walked, the more I realized just how far I had wandered from reality. The stillness around me was unnerving, and no matter how hard I looked, there was no sign of any other living soul. The air felt cold, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the absence of life that made it cold. The roads were empty. There were no houses, no trees, no streetlights. It was as though the world had been erased, leaving behind only a hollow echo of what once was. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking when I noticed something strange in the distance, a flicker of light. It was faint at first, like a star on the horizon, but it grew brighter as I approached. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was there someone else out here? Or was it another illusion, another trick of the dark that would lead me deeper into the nightmare? As I got closer, the light revealed itself to be a small lamppost, standing alone in the middle of the road, casting an eerie glow in the vast emptiness. I stopped in my tracks, feeling an unsettling shiver crawl up my spine. The lamppost looked out of place, like it didn't belong here in the middle of nowhere. It was old, weathered, its light flickering in a way that didn't seem quite natural. I approached it slowly, my every instinct screaming for me to turn around, to leave, but I couldn't help myself. There was something pulling me forward, as if the light was calling to me. And then I saw it. The road ahead was no longer empty. The bus had returned. It sat there in the distance, parked under the dim light of the lamppost, like it had been waiting for me to return. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My body tensed, and my heart began to pound in my chest. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that the bus had come back, or that it seemed to be waiting for me, as if it knew I would eventually show up. But I wasn't going to make the same mistake again. I wasn't going to board it. I wasn't going to let whatever it was take me again. I turned away from the bus, my legs moving before I could think, and I ran. I ran as fast as I could, the pounding of my feet echoing in the silence, drowning out every other sound. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed myself, I couldn't escape. It was as if the world itself was closing in on me. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the road twisted and shifted, warping like it was alive, like it was trapping me, pushing me back toward the bus. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The terror that gripped me was like nothing I had ever known. It wasn't just the fear of what had happened, but the knowledge that I wasn't free, that I wasn't in control. The shadows were all around me now, moving, reaching, and I could feel them closing in, like they were part of me, part of the nightmare that had started the moment I had boarded that last bus ride. Eventually, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. My body was exhausted, every inch of me worn down by the relentless terror. The shadows loomed over me, and I could hear the faint sound of something footsteps. No, it couldn't be. I had to be imagining it. I looked up, hoping for some sign of salvation, some flicker of hope, but there was nothing. Just the cold, empty road stretching endlessly in front of me, leading nowhere. The bus had disappeared again, just as it had before, as if it had never been there at all. And yet, the feeling remained. The fear, the darkness, the sense that I was still being watched, still being followed. It was as if the very night itself was alive, waiting for me to return, to be taken again. I couldn't help but wonder, was I really free? Or had I simply entered a new stage of the nightmare, one that would follow me wherever I went? Would the bus ever stop? Would the shadows ever leave? Or had I become part of something far darker, something I couldn't escape? It was supposed to be an ordinary road trip, nothing special. The kind of trip where you set out with the usual excitement of the open road, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, the wind brushing against the car windows, and the constant anticipation of reaching your destination. But that night, the road became something else entirely, something I would never be able to forget. Let me set the stage for you. It was late in the evening, around 10 o'clock. I had just finished work, my mind still a bit foggy from the day's grind. The plan was simple: drive out to the mountains for the weekend, enjoy some peace, and recharge before heading back to reality on Monday morning. Nothing crazy, just a peaceful drive with a little adventure. I'm the type of person who enjoys solo trips like this. The peace of being on the road alone, no one to talk to, no distractions, just me and the road. I had planned everything out. The route was mapped, the car was packed, and I had snacks at arm's reach. I'd driven this route before, and it was the perfect escape from the monotony of everyday life. I had taken this route many times. A straight shot through the countryside, passing by farms, the occasional house, and long stretches of nothing but trees and fields. I had never thought much of it, to be honest. It was just a road, an extension of my usual routine. The familiarity of it was comforting, and I didn't see any reason why tonight should be any different. As I merged onto the highway, I had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. I remember glancing at the dashboard: fuel, check speed, within limits, and the road, as clear as I could see. I had the window down a little, letting the crisp evening air filter through the car. The world outside was quiet, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight passing by. It was a nice, uneventful drive. The kind you can lose yourself in without even realizing how much time has passed. That's how I felt anyway. But all of that was about to come to a halt. After a couple of hours, I noticed that I was nearing a small town. It wasn't on the main route, but close enough that I could make a quick detour to grab some coffee. There was a road that cut through the outskirts, leading toward a small diner I had passed on the way up before. I was feeling a little tired, and a warm drink sounded good. The place was always quiet, and I liked the peace it offered. That's when it happened. I was on the road, minding my own business, when I saw it. An old, faded sign, partially covered by the growing vine of a nearby bush. The sign was so weathered, it barely made an impression. Dead end, it read. I had no idea what the sign was for. The road I was on wasn't supposed to be a dead end, at least according to the map. But the further I drove, the less I trusted the signs. I could have just ignored it, turned around, and taken a different route, but something about it called to me. Maybe it was the adventure or the challenge of seeing where this road would lead. Perhaps it was the eerie feeling that started to gnaw at me, a strange feeling that something was off, but too vague to explain. It was one of those subtle gut feelings you get when something doesn't seem right. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I decided to take a chance. As I took the turn onto the road marked by the sign, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going down a path I shouldn't be on. There was no going back now. I continued driving, passing through the thickening trees, the branches brushing against the sides of the car. The road was narrow and winding, and the farther I drove, the more isolated I felt. No streetlights here, just the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. The occasional house came into view, but the windows were all dark. Not a single soul around. Minutes turned into hours, or so it felt. The longer I drove, the more the unease crept into my mind. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no signs of civilization. I had to stop and check my map. Something wasn't right. When I pulled over to check my phone, I realized that I had no signal. My phone displayed the dreaded "no service" message. That's when I started to wonder what kind of detour I had really taken. The world outside the car seemed darker now, almost suffocating, as though the trees and the night had closed in on me. And that's when I started to hear the noises. At first, it was just the occasional crackling sound like something moving through the underbrush. But then, as I sat there, I realized it wasn't just random wildlife. No, it was something more deliberate. My heart rate quickened as I turned the key in the ignition, starting the car and shifting it into gear. But something didn't feel right. The engine sputtered in a way I had never heard before. It was as though the car was struggling against something, or someone. But who could it be? I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights of another car, someone who might be lost too. But there was nothing there. Just endless darkness stretching behind me. Panic began to set in. This detour, which had seemed so innocent at first, was now turning into a nightmare I couldn't explain. And I had no idea how much further it would go before I would be able to turn around, retrace my steps, and get back to safety. That feeling, the one where you realize you've made a wrong turn into something you never should have encountered, is a feeling you never forget. At that moment, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't explain why, but that night felt off. It wasn't just the strange, desolate road I found myself on, or the eerie quiet that surrounded me. It was something more. A sense that I was being watched, though there was no one in sight. The trees seemed to close in on me as if they were alive, and every turn in the road felt like it was leading me further away from reality. As I continued down that narrow, winding road, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just the darkness or the absence of any other cars on the road. No, it was something far more tangible. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I tried to brush it off. After all, I was on a road I didn't know, in a place I wasn't familiar with. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The tires hummed on the road as I tried to focus on the task at hand, getting back to where I belonged. But no matter how hard I tried to calm my nerves, the feeling never left. It started with a simple sound, a soft thump against the side of the car. At first, I thought it was just a branch or something else from the dense woods brushing against the vehicle. But when the thump repeated, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the sound of a tree or a loose object bouncing off the car. No, this was different. It felt deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I quickly glanced in the side mirror, expecting to see something moving in the dark. But there was nothing, just the same empty road behind me, stretching out into the night. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the sound of a rock or something else hitting the car. I tried to dismiss the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. But that's when I heard it again, a sharp, deliberate thump, this time louder, as if it had come from the front of the car. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed my foot on the brakes, coming to an abrupt halt in the middle of the road. The car's engine sputtered, and for a moment, all I could hear was the heavy silence of the night. No rustling leaves, no sounds of animals, just the oppressive quiet, hanging heavily in the air. I sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I knew I had to get out and check, but a voice inside me screamed to stay put, to keep driving. My mind raced through every possible explanation, perhaps a wild animal, a falling branch, or even just my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few moments of hesitation, I finally unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out of the car. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I looked around, the beam of the headlights illuminating nothing but the road ahead. The trees loomed over me like towering giants, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. But there was no sound, no movement, nothing. I stepped around to the front of the car, my eyes scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No branches or debris that could have caused the thumping sound. Just the road, the trees, and the darkness stretching ahead of me. I walked back to the driver's side, my footsteps muffled by the thick dirt road. I was about to get back in the car when I saw it. There, just off the side of the road, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was something else, something much more unsettling. A silhouette, tall and thin, standing completely still among the trees. It was barely visible, but the faint outline of its form was unmistakable. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't moving, but it was there, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to get back in the car, to drive away from this strange place. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It wasn't just the figure itself that terrified me, it was the way it made me feel, as if I were an intruder in its world, as if it had been there for much longer than I had, waiting for me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at that figure. But eventually, I forced myself to take a step backward toward the car. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my mind spinning with fear. I didn't dare take my eyes off the figure, but I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. I quickly climbed back into the car, my heart racing. The engine started with a sputter, but it roared to life. I shifted into gear and pressed the gas pedal, the car jolting forward as I sped down the road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove, my mind replayed the scene over and over again. What had I just seen? Who or what was that figure? And why had it felt like it was watching me, waiting for me? The road stretched on ahead, but the eerie feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The trees seemed to press in closer around me, as if they were closing off any escape. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the air in the car felt heavier with each passing minute. That was when I noticed something else. The road was different. The familiar landmarks I had passed earlier, the farmhouses, the trees, the small bends in the road were gone. In their place was an empty, desolate stretch of land. The road had twisted, bent in ways I hadn't remembered. I tried to stay calm, rational. I must have taken a wrong turn, that's all. I must have missed a sign, gotten lost somehow. But even as I convinced myself of that, I knew deep down that something wasn't right. I had been driving for far too long. The miles weren't adding up. Then, just as the panic began to set in, I saw it another sign, a small one, barely visible in the dim light. It was old, weathered, like it had been there for years. And on that sign were the words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Welcome to Eldridge Hollow. I had never heard of Eldridge Hollow, but I knew immediately that this wasn't the road I had planned to take. I had made a mistake. A big one. My heart began to race again as I looked out the windshield, hoping to see some sign of civilization. But there was nothing. Only the dark, endless road ahead, stretching on into the unknown. I couldn't turn back now. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. Something told me I needed to keep going. Something told me the road I had taken wasn't just a wrong turn. It was the start of something much, much worse. The strange events didn't stop. In fact, they only grew more frequent and intense as the night wore on. What had started as a subtle feeling of unease had escalated into something much more tangible, something I couldn't ignore. The road stretched out before me like an endless ribbon of darkness, the headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that had begun to roll in. The air had grown colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly I could see my breath misting in front of me, despite the heat on full blast inside the car. I glanced around nervously, trying to focus on the road, but the eerie quiet seemed to settle around me like a heavy blanket. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals had completely vanished. It was as though the world itself had gone silent, as if everything was holding its breath. And then it happened again. The thumping sound, the same one I had heard earlier, only this time it was louder, more forceful. It wasn't just coming from the side of the car, it was coming from the front, as though something was walking directly in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing in my chest, but the road ahead remained empty. I quickly checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadow or some kind of movement behind me, but there was nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the headlights, something watching me. The air had grown thick with tension, and every little sound, every creak of the car, every whisper of wind felt amplified in the silence. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Then, as if on cue, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the road, barely visible in the darkness. At first, I thought it was another person, someone lost or stranded, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a shape, too tall and too thin, its outline almost blending with the shadows around it. I slammed on the brakes again, bringing the car to a screeching halt. For a moment, I just stared, my eyes locked on the figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, motionless, as if it had been waiting for me to approach. My breath caught in my throat, and I had the overwhelming urge to look away, to drive off as fast as I could. But something kept me frozen in place, something deep within me telling me to stay. I don't know how long I stared at the figure, but it felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, without warning, the figure began to move. Slowly at first, almost as if it were gliding rather than walking, its long limbs stretching and bending in unnatural ways. It moved toward the car, its silhouette growing larger and more defined with each passing second. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, my tires screeching against the pavement as I tore down the road. The car seemed to lurch forward, as though it were struggling to escape the clutches of whatever was behind me. I didn't dare look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, following me, its presence lingering in the periphery of my vision. The headlights barely pierced the fog that now enveloped the road, and the further I drove, the more isolated I felt. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just the empty, desolate road ahead, stretching on into the unknown. And then, just as I thought I might be able to outrun the terror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shape standing at the side of the road, just ahead. Another figure. And then another. They were everywhere. They were lined up along the road, standing in perfect silence, watching me as I approached. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They simply stood there, like statues, their eyes locked on the car. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was unraveling, and I needed to find a way out of this nightmare. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, pushing the car faster, the engine roaring as the figures blurred past me. The road seemed to stretch on forever, but no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that they were following me. The figures were everywhere now, their silhouettes appearing and disappearing in the fog like ghosts, never getting closer, but never far enough away either. I didn't know what they were, but I had a feeling they weren't human. There was something wrong about them, something that felt unnatural. And I couldn't shake the thought that I had somehow stumbled into a place where I didn't belong, a place where things had gone terribly wrong. The car seemed to be getting harder to control. The engine sputtered, and the headlights flickered as if they were struggling to stay on. The road ahead seemed to twist and bend in impossible ways, the signs and landmarks I had passed earlier now completely gone. It was as though the world itself was shifting, warping around me, and I was powerless to stop it. I had to find a way out, but every turn I made only seemed to lead me deeper into the darkness. It was as if the road itself was playing tricks on me, guiding me towards some unknown destination, some point of no return. I tried to calm myself, tried to think logically. There had to be an explanation. Maybe this was all a bad dream. Maybe I had hit my head and was hallucinating. But the cold reality of the situation told me otherwise. I was awake, and I was very much alone. The fog had thickened, and the air inside the car felt heavier with each passing second. It was as though the very atmosphere around me had become oppressive, choking the life out of everything. The road was winding, twisting in ways that didn't make sense, and the trees that lined the path seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was suffocating, drowning in the eerie silence that surrounded me. My heart raced, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. That's when I heard it again. The thumping. But this time, it was inside the car. At first, it was faint, like something tapping against the floor. But then it grew louder, more insistent, as though someone or something was knocking on the windows from the inside. My blood ran cold, and I glanced around the car, terrified that something was right beside me, breathing down my neck. But there was nothing. No one. Just the empty darkness pressing in from all sides. The thumping continued, louder now, as though it were coming from the back seat. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what was happening. Was someone in the car with me? Was it possible that the figures from outside had somehow gotten inside? I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I reached for the rearview mirror. But there was nothing in the back seat. Just emptiness. No figures, no signs of movement. And then, just as I began to relax, thinking that maybe I had imagined it all, I heard it again. A voice. Low, guttural, and far too close for comfort. "Turn back." The word sent a jolt of pure terror through my body. I couldn't process it. There was no one in the car, no one speaking. Yet the voice was undeniable. It was real. I snapped my head toward the rearview mirror again, my eyes scanning every inch of the back seat, but it remained empty. The voice had come from nowhere. That's when I realized, whatever was happening, it wasn't something I could run from. The road, the figures, the voice, it was all connected. And I was trapped, hurtling towards something I couldn't understand. Something that was pulling me deeper into its grasp with every passing moment. And then the fog thickened even more, the headlights almost useless, and all I could do was brace myself for whatever came next. The fog had swallowed the world around me. The road, now barely visible through the thick haze, twisted and turned like some kind of twisted labyrinth. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, the headlights casting ghostly shadows that seemed to move and shift with every turn. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it deafening in my ears, a constant reminder that something was horribly wrong. I couldn't tell if it was the car or the road that was distorting reality anymore. The world outside felt as though it were folding in on itself, blurring into something unrecognizable. The thumping had stopped for the moment, but that didn't make me feel any safer. The silence was almost worse, like the calm before the storm. And then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw it. The figure, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the silhouette. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure, unable to move. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, like some twisted reflection of a human being. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a wave of pure terror crashing over me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, my body frozen in place, the car's engine idling in the silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But every instinct in my body screamed that it was. That whatever stood in front of me wasn't just a figment of my imagination, wasn't a trick of the fog. It was real. I wanted to look away. I wanted to drive off, to get as far away from this thing as I could, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey, my hands glued to the steering wheel, my feet unmoving on the pedals. The figure began to move toward the car, its movements jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. It took slow, deliberate steps, each one making an unnerving sound as its feet dragged against the road, the echo of it ringing in the silence like a death knell. My pulse raced, and for the first time, I felt a true sense of danger. The kind of danger that doesn't just exist in stories, in nightmares. It was real, and it was coming for me. As it drew closer, I felt a chill creep through the car, colder than the air outside, colder than anything I had ever felt before. The fog seemed to thicken around us, closing in, as if the world itself was conspiring to trap me here. The figure was inches from the car now, and I could see it more clearly than ever. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. Its fingers, long and spindly, reached toward the window, its nails scraping against the glass like claws. The sound was deafening, like something scraping against metal. And then it spoke. The voice was low, guttural, like something from the depths of the earth. And when it spoke, I felt it in my chest, vibrating through my very bones. Turn back, or you'll never leave. The words sent a shock through me, a wave of terror that had me gasping for breath. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing in front of me. It was right there, so close, so impossibly close. The air around us felt charged, like something was about to break, like the world was hanging on the edge of a knife. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The only thing I could do was stare, wide-eyed, at the creature that stood before me, its hollow eyes never leaving mine. Leave now, while you still can. The words were barely a whisper, but they felt like a command, a warning. Something deep inside me screamed to obey, to get out of there, to do anything to escape. But I couldn't. My body refused to move. The creature raised one hand, its fingers pressing against the window. I could feel the coldness of its touch through the glass, and for a moment, I thought the window might crack under the pressure. My breath fogged up the glass as I pressed myself back into the seat, but I couldn't escape. I was trapped. The figure's eyes never left mine as it spoke again, its voice now a low growl. You're not alone out here. The words sent a wave of dread over me, and suddenly I understood. This wasn't just one creature. It wasn't just one thing waiting for me. The entire road, the entire area was wrong. I could feel something else now, something in the darkness. I wasn't alone anymore. There were others. I could hear them, two faint whispers at the edge of my hearing, like distant voices, like the rustling of something just beyond the reach of the headlights. And they were getting closer. Panic surged through me, my chest tightening with every passing second. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, throwing the car into motion, the engine roaring to life. The car lurched forward, the tires screeching as I sped past the figure, not daring to look back. But as I drove, the feeling didn't go away. The whispers didn't fade. I could feel the eyes on me, the weight of something following me, something just beyond the reach of the headlights. I was being pursued, hunted, and I knew it. There was no escaping this, no outrunning it. The fog grew thicker, the road stretching on forever, the same twisted, endless path. It was as though the road had no end, no beginning, just a loop that led me deeper into the nightmare. I tried to calm myself, tried to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. My mind was unraveling, my thoughts spiraling into chaos. And then I saw it again. Another figure, standing in the middle of the road. This time, I didn't even think. I swerved, the car skidding out of control as I tried to avoid it, but there were more. They were everywhere, surrounding me, closing in from all sides, their eyes locked on me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I tried to stop the car, tried to turn around, but the road wouldn't let me. It kept pulling me forward, deeper into the fog, deeper into the nightmare that I had unknowingly walked into. I was trapped. I couldn't escape. And then, in the midst of it all, the ground beneath the car seemed to shift. The road cracked open, a deep, yawning chasm appearing out of nowhere. The car lurched again, the wheels spinning wildly as I fought to keep control, but it was no use. The car tipped over the edge, falling into the darkness below. For a moment, I thought it was the end. I thought I would never make it out of this place, that I would be swallowed by the darkness, by the creatures, by whatever force had trapped me here. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The car settled, the engine died, and the whispers faded into nothingness. The fog cleared, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe again. But when I looked around, I realized something that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I wasn't alone. There were others in the darkness, watching me. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had made a terrible mistake. I had entered a place where I didn't belong, and now there was no way out. The car sat on the edge of the cliff, teetering precariously as I tried to make sense of the madness around me. I was alive somehow, but that didn't mean I was safe. I had no idea where I was, or how to get back to the world I knew. The thick fog still clung to the air, muffling everything, turning the world into a void of gray and shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was waiting for me to make the wrong move. For a moment, I just sat there, unable to move. My fingers still gripped the steering wheel, my breath shallow, ragged. I wanted to scream, but my voice seemed to be lost in the oppressive silence. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they weren't gone. They were still out there, lurking in the fog, waiting. I slowly turned my head, my heart hammering in my chest as I scanned the darkness around me. There was nothing. No figures. No movement. Just the desolate stretch of road, the cliff's edge, and the endless fog. It was as if the world itself had swallowed up everything else, leaving only me and this accursed place behind. But I knew better than to think I was alone. The creature's words echoed in my mind. "You're not alone out here." That warning wasn't just a threat. It was the truth. There were things in this place, things that had been watching me from the very beginning. Things I couldn't understand, couldn't escape. And now I was trapped. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let myself be consumed by this nightmare. But I had no idea how to leave, or even if it was possible. I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell was going on, what I had stumbled into, and how to survive it. With a shaky breath, I forced myself to open the door and step outside. The air was cold, biting at my skin as I stood on the edge of the road, looking out over the chasm. The fog stretched endlessly in all directions, and I could see nothing but the gray void. There were no landmarks, no signs, no indication of where I was. It felt like I was standing at the edge of the world itself. I looked down at the car, still hanging over the cliff, the engine silent now. It was as if the car, like me, had given up. It was no longer part of the world I knew. I couldn't drive it. I couldn't trust it. I started walking. There was no plan, no direction, just the instinct to move, to get away, to find something that made sense. The fog was thick, and with each step I took, I felt like I was getting deeper into it. The air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating, making it harder to breathe. The road twisted and turned, winding in ways that didn't make sense. I was walking for what felt like hours, but the world never changed. It was just the same unending stretch of road, the same cold fog, the same oppressive silence. There was no way out, no sign of life, just this endless loop, this endless nightmare. As I walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following me, just out of sight, keeping pace with every step I took. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The fog was too thick. But the feeling lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. It was then that I saw something in the distance, a flicker of movement. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickened my pace, the hope of seeing something, anything, fueling my desperation. But as I got closer, the movement stopped. The fog swallowed it up, leaving me with nothing but more emptiness. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold, damp air, as if trying to grasp onto something solid. My mind was racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break free from this. I couldn't just keep walking into nothingness. I had to find a way to escape, to make it back home. But no matter how far I walked, nothing changed. The road stretched on forever, the fog closing in tighter with each step. It was as if I was walking in circles, trapped in an endless loop. The whispers began again, low and insistent, like a distant hum that filled the air around me. I stopped in my tracks. There was something different about the whispers now. They weren't just random voices, they were calling me. My name. Over and over again, their voices growing louder, more insistent. It was like the fog itself was alive, like it was trying to pull me deeper into its grasp. I turned around, fear gripping me like a vice. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get away. I couldn't let myself be consumed by this place. But as I took a step forward, something stopped me. A figure, no, more than one, stood at the edge of the road, just barely visible through the fog. They were watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I froze, my blood running cold. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't human. There was something unnatural about them, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. And then one of them stepped forward. Its face was obscured by the fog, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. The air around me grew colder, and I shivered uncontrollably. "Leave," it said, its voice barely a whisper, but somehow it felt like it was inside my head. "You don't belong here." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The fear was too overwhelming, too paralyzing. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, unable to move. The figure took another step toward me, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. I could feel its cold gaze on me, could feel it digging into my soul. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't. I was trapped. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The fog swallowed it whole, leaving me standing there, alone once again. The whispers died down, the air growing still. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know what I had seen or what I had been a part of. But one thing was clear. Whatever this place was, whatever force had brought me here, it wasn't finished with me yet. I turned and began walking again, the hopelessness creeping in with each step. I didn't know where I was going, or if I could ever escape. But deep down, I knew that the nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. It would follow me. It would always follow me. The road stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving, and I walked into the fog, not knowing what awaited me in the darkness. And that was the last I knew of the world I had once known. The days passed, but they felt like years. Each step, each movement, seemed to blur into the next as I walked through the fog, endlessly searching for a way out. My mind, once sharp and clear, began to dull, overtaken by the oppressive weight of the endless gray. I couldn't tell how long I had been walking, or if time still even existed. It was as though the world itself had stopped, trapped in an eternal moment. The road ahead remained the same, just a winding path cutting through the thick, suffocating fog. I had tried to make sense of it, tried to find patterns in the desolation, but there were none. The landmarks, the trees, the signs, everything I'd known, everything that had once given the world structure was gone. And all I had left was the endless march forward, the pull of an invisible force urging me onward. I thought about the figures I had seen, the ones who had stood in the fog, watching me. Their presence still haunted me. I had tried to deny what I felt, tried to push away the knowledge that whatever this place was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't just some random stretch of land. No, it was something older, something far more dangerous, lurking just beneath the surface of reality. I thought about the voice, the one that had whispered my name, urging me to leave, telling me I didn't belong here. I had ignored it. I had pressed on, driven by a desperate need to understand, to break free from the nightmare that had overtaken my life. But now, with every step, I began to question whether I could ever escape, whether I even wanted to escape. I had been running from the unknown, from the terrifying, shadowed truth that the fog seemed to represent. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that what was truly terrifying was not the fog, or the figures, or the whispers. What was truly terrifying was the possibility that I had never left the world I had once known. What if I was always here, trapped in this place, and it was the world I remembered that was the illusion? That thought, that realization, hit me like a bolt of lightning. My chest tightened and my breath caught in my throat. What if I was already dead? What if this was the place where souls went to wander, lost forever in the fog, unable to move on? I stumbled, catching myself against the side of the road. The dizziness overtook me again, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. I closed my eyes, taking a few shallow breaths, trying to steady myself. The fog pressed in, and I could feel the weight of it, as though it was trying to suffocate me. But as I stood there, on the edge of the world, something shifted. There, in the distance, I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was one of the shadows, one of the strange, silent figures that had been following me since the moment I had wandered into this forsaken place. But as the figure drew closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a person. I watched, unsure whether to move or stay still, as the figure slowly approached, the fog swirling around them like a cloak. The air seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, and the temperature dropped even further. The closer the person got, the more their face became clear. It was a face I had seen before. It was mine. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. It wasn't just my face, it was me, standing there, staring back at me with cold, empty eyes. The figure was an exact copy, every detail a perfect replica. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. And then, in the silence that seemed to stretch on forever, the figure spoke. "You've been here longer than you think." The voice was my own, but it sounded strange, twisted, as though it came from some deep, forgotten place. I didn't know how to respond. There were no words, no explanation. There was only the figure, standing still in the fog, looking at me with an expression of profound sadness. I took a tentative step forward, my body trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. I reached out a hand, hoping to touch it, to confirm that this was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. As my hand neared the figure, a sudden rush of air swept through the fog, and the figure dissolved before my eyes. The air grew still again, the fog closing in tighter around me. For a moment, I was left standing there, in complete silence. The chill in the air remained, gnawing at my bones. My chest felt tight, as if I was drowning in the cold. I had no answers. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know who or what that figure had been. But one thing was clear. I was still trapped. This place, this fog, this never-ending road, I was still here. And I wasn't alone. I had learned nothing. There were no answers, no resolutions. Only the endless, suffocating fog that pressed in on me, the road stretching into oblivion, and the whisper of my own voice still echoing in the distance. I started walking again, the only thing I could do. There was no destination, no hope of finding a way out. The fog would never lift. The road would never end. And the shadow of whatever force held me in its grip would never let go.